Our January 22nd regular City Council meeting. Please join me in the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Councilmember Ingstrom.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Wagner. Here. Councilmember Stearns.
Here.
Councilmember Stackla.
Here.
Mayor Mortar.
I'm here. Okay. I see some new faces and some not so new faces out there tonight. Welcome. This is the time on the agenda where we invite those who are here to present us with just a comment or an introduction, whatever you'd like, about an item that is not on the agenda later in the evening. So I want to welcome, it looks like a CHP officer, Kyle Foster, and his buddy. Come on up. You have, I should say that, please state your name, and you have 3 minutes to offer your comment, and it'll turn yellow when you are almost out of time. We ask you to keep an eye on that. Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and ladies and gentlemen of the City Council. My name is Kyle Foster. I'm a lieutenant with the California Highway Patrol, and I'm the new commander of the Mount Shasta area. So I will be serving in your community as the commander of the area. My office has 19 officers, 3 sergeants, and several support staff, and we serve both Siskiyou and Shasta County along the I-5 corridor and Highway 89 through McLeod. Also with me today is Lieutenant Commander Kevin Lunty, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Good evening, folks, board, Madam Mayor. I'm the new commander in the Dunsmuir facility, just south of you here. Just happy to be here and support Kyle and help him out in any way I can, and kind of get familiar with all you folks in case we see you around town and we can say hi.
And your name again?
I'm sorry. First name is Kevin, last name is Lunty, L-U-N-T-E-Y.
And ladies and gentlemen, the purpose for me coming in to introduce myself and Lieutenant Lunty is just so you guys can recognize our faces. It'll be my hope that I come to at least one quarterly City Council meeting. So if the community or yourselves have any questions for me, I'll be readily available for you. I also make available my personal contact information for you. So if you guys would like to email or call me at any time, you can do so. And again, if the city has any questions for me, I'll be happy to come and speak during a regular session to address those issues.
Welcome. Thank you very much. It's great to meet you. I wish you well in your new assignment.
Great. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Any questions for either Kyle or Kevin from other council members? Or welcomes? Okay.
Thank you very much.
You brought snow with you today, so thanks a lot. All right. Whoa. You'll be busy. Okay. Any other public comment then? At this point. Seeing none, then I would like to move on to our council and staff comments. Can we begin with you, City Manager Bruce Pope?
Thank you, Mayor Mortar, members of the council. Since our last meeting, staff has been continuing our efforts to work on 2 major areas, one being housing development, the other being economic development. In the economic development area, we have met with members of the Siskiyou County Economic Development Commission and looking at strategies and approaches to attracting businesses, potential businesses to Mount Shasta. In the housing area, we've been working on a couple of housing projects, theoretical projects that we might bring to fruition. And we'll continue working those as those kind of get fleshed out. We'll bring those through the appropriate channels and up for council consideration. Our intent here is to continue working on these 2 issues until we can get actual projects written and put together and bring to the council. Staff is also, I think if you look at December's report, Public Works has completed their work on the engineering and environmental assessment of the replacement of Tank 1. Since that work, the staff has submitted their application for funding for the actual construction of Tank 1 and the water line in South Mount Shasta. I'll be working with Rod. Typically, the state can take anywhere from 6 to 9 months to review an application. Our application is in. If they take 9 months, and if we get it awarded, we've missed the construction season. So what we'd like to do is with Rod and probably help pace to see if we can't build in a justification for prioritization of that project, see if we can't move it forward a little more expeditiously. We did receive the report from Climate Tech, the consulting firm that we retained to do an energy analysis. That report has just come in. We're reviewing it at a staff level. We'll be putting together the analysis and then bringing that to council with recommendations. And just with feedback on the landing, the hotel feasibility study was contracted for. It is moving along. They still expect to have the feasibility study completed and presented in early March of this year. That's obviously a very critical element in what will go into their proposal for the landing. So as that gets developed, we will share that with the council, planning commission, and the public. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from council of Bruce? Comments? No? Any other staff comments at this time? We have quite a crew of visitors. Thank you, gentlemen, for driving up from the Southland. Okay, how about city council comments? Paul, do you have anything? Nothing? John? Barbara? Tim?
Briefly, I want to inform council and staff, and I think there will be an email coming out to us all, of a conference being held down in Sacramento February 8th. It's called California Housing Crisis. It's an all-day conference with a lot of participants, everywhere from California Coalition of Rural Housing, Sacramento Housing Alliance, Bay Area Council, Housing California, California Building Industry Association, etc. Cost of attendance is $149 if registered by January 22nd. $99 rate for California state government staff. I don't know if that includes city staff or not. 9:15 to 3:15, I would hope that there can be some folks from Mount Shasta attending that.
Is that in our inboxes now, Tim? Did you say?
I sent it out today,
Okay.
so.
Did we need to RSVP today for like early bird special?
January 22nd, which is 10 days from, which is today.
Time flies.
Well, maybe we can do it by tomorrow and still get in, or by tonight.
Who's hosting it? Oh,
Thank you to our sponsors, California Endowment, the Tribal Alliance of Sovereign Indian Nations, KP Public Affairs, California Professional Firefighter Associated, Builders and Contractors of Northern California, Capital Advocacy, Western State Petroleum
Okay, thank you.
Association, California.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, thank you. I'm not listening anymore. Thank you. Okay. Okay, I'd like to offer some comments if you're finished, Tim. Did you have anything
I
else?
was also going to just comment about Saturday and the Women's March, but you may want to do that instead.
Go ahead.
Couldn't we do it at the end of the meeting?
That's fine.
Outside
Okay.
attendance?
So I have several comments I have here. At last meeting, we had a concern expressed about the smell of propane in the building. Our fire department folks have checked it out, and the city park staff is well aware of it, and they've had it checked many times, and apparently it's not a leaking propane problem. It may be something having to do with the stove burners or something, but it's not something that we have to worry about, propane. Is there anything you would want to add, either of you, Kathy or Bruce, on that? So we did check it out, and just want to allay any fears you have about leaking propane. We've also had some comments about the sound at almost every meeting, and I hear the sound much better in my mic today, but if there are those of you in the audience who are not hearing us, our new method is to speak into the mic either 2 or 3 fingers away from it. So if you see us cross-eyed looking at the mic, that's what we're trying to learn here. But please let us know if you don't hear us. We're still making improvements on that system. There was an article in the paper following our discussion about events that had some folks confused. I received a couple of phone calls about it because in the paper, I think, maybe it was Councilmember Stearns mentioned something about the grant support we've given the museum and others. Those are 2 separate processes. Those are 2 separate things. We currently have an application process, an extensive application process to grant small amounts of money. That is not the subject of the events consideration, the private events, the support of the city for the private events that we are still in the process of considering. Just wanted to make that clear that those are 2 distinct things. I'd like to congratulate Juliana, our planner, for being apparently the only other city besides Sacramento to have our cannabis licensing prep done to the point where we could issue those permits on January 1 on the first day of the season. That was amazing preparation, and I know some hard work over the days right prior to Christmas, Juliana, so thank you. Lastly, just for those of you who may not have noticed, I've started what I call the mayor chat on Wednesday mornings at 9:30 to 11 at Lucille's. For those of you who might want an opportunity to share any concerns you have or ask questions, I'll do my best to follow up for those things I don't have answers to. And it's on a first-come, first-served basis, so I don't know if people are going to knock down the door, but if you do come, please be aware that there may be others waiting in line who also want to have a chat. So looking forward to learning what I may hear from you. Just last thing, the Lake Street light, Rod, it's blinking away. Mount Shasta Boulevard and Lake Street? Because of the snow. Oh, because of the snow. So what does that mean? Because it always does when it snows? I've forgotten.
We put it in flash mode when it snows because the vehicles, traffic markings on the road surface aren't visible, so people don't always get in the turn lane for the signals to
I
work
see.
accurately. So,
Okay.
and it's easier while we're plowing, additionally, to put them in flash mode while we have the snow
Okay,
berms
thank you,
in.
makes sense. I'm happy to hear that it didn't break again.
No, it's still functioning,
That's good.
unlike Alma Street.
Good news, okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Quick.
And a citizen asked me about the street light at Alma in Mount Shasta Boulevard, and I know we approved the fix on that. Is that like $150,000 approximately we're paying to upgrade, or is it replacement?
Mostly replacement. It's, I believe we budgeted 100,000, 80 plus the 20 of the new money, gas
Oh,
tax money.
100,000 plus 20,000?
No,
So
80 plus 20. So
80 plus
100
20.
total
About
is what we
100.
have budgeted. We have begun procuring parts, the equipment, the cabinet, signal cabinet, all the replacement electronics. The signal pole arms, we put out a bid request for those,
Okay,
and the project will go out to bid in the next month or so.
okay, great, thanks.
Okay, good. If there are no other comments or questions, I'd like to move to consent agenda. City manager recommends approval of the following consent agenda items. All resolutions and ordinances on this agenda or added hereto shall be introduced or adopted as applicable by title only, and the full reading thereof is hereby waived. A, approval of minutes January 8th, 2018, regular city council meeting. B, approval of disbursements, accounts payable 1/4 and 1/8, 2018, total gross payroll and taxes for the period ending 12/31/17. C, monthly financial and investment report. D, CDBG program income reuse agreement. E, AB 2788, maintenance of effort, public safety. And lastly, F, continuum of care memorandum of understanding. Is there a motion for approval?
I'll move that the city council approve the consent agenda numbers 7A through F as just read.
And is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Unanimous, thank you. Okay, let's move now to item number 8, council approval of resolution authorizing PACE Engineering to begin work on drinking water state revolving fund planning grant activities. Rod?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. We recently have received the final 2 of 3 drinking water SRF planning grants and 6 total, counting the clean water SRF planning grants. These most recent 2 planning grants, agreements that we received from the State Water Resources Control Board will allow us to complete the planning efforts for the Spring Hill Water Supply and Storage Project, as well as the Water Distribution System Improvements Project. The Spring Hill Water Supply and Storage Planning Project in the amount of $489,000 will consist of project administration, hydrogeological study, engineering project report, some test well drilling, sampling and analysis, site and easement acquisition, and as well as the environmental documentation. The Water Distribution System Improvements Project is $500,000 for the planning work for replacement of existing water lines, essentially around town in several different areas. It will consist of the project administration, engineering project report, environmental documentation, surveying, mapping, 80% design, and right-of-way acquisition. So the resolution you have before you tonight with the task orders will allow PACE to begin work on these 2 planning efforts to make these projects ready for eligible for construction funding in the future.
Thank you. Questions of Rod?
Rod, in terms of these planning grant activities, can we ensure that in the design we provide for at least empty conduit to go in the trenches anywhere we dig, so that in the future we have that capability of perhaps stringing fiber in the trenches as well, consistent with a dig once policy?
We can certainly, definitely consider that where possible. Yeah, probably more so on the water distribution system project where there's going to be more trenching. But that's certainly something we can at least look into incorporating into the design of that project. It does raise some questions, as it has before, with respect to standards. Whose standards do you build it to? So, and in some cases, it could be just really short, piecemeal conduit sections with no interconnectivity, but it is something to consider.
Piece by piece. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate the forward thinking.
Other questions of our PACE folks or Rod?
Sure. I guess this would be to both of you. These are two separate projects, or possibly more, depending on how you look at it. This money covers the planning, CEQA, all that type of thing, and that's fine. What do you estimate it'll cost to do each of these individual projects, just for my own edification? I know we talked about it in the past, but construction costs go up, so.
Yeah. I might ask Paul Reuter to help me with the
Okay.
construction cost estimates, because I don't know if I've seen those yet. Or if I have, it's been a while.
Yeah, that's one of the purposes of the planning, is to kind of figure that out. But I think the Spring Hill project is probably a $3 million project, somewhere in that range. And the water main replacements is, what, in the 5 million, Keith, somewhere around there. We tried to scope that because that's the maximum grant amount that the city can get in one projects. So we tried to do as much as we could. So I think we'll be in those magnitudes.
And then the Roseburg project, is that included in the 8 million, that line?
No, that Tank 1 project, that's a separate
Okay.
project and a separate planning grant, and all that planning work has been completed. The application for funding's been submitted, so we're just waiting for the construction grant agreement on that one.
Taking up with that tangent, since we haven't trenched that project yet, would it be possible to lay empty conduit as part of that project? Well, because that's a long project going down Mount Shasta Boulevard.
Right. I think anything's possible. My concerns would be that I would want adequate separation from the water line to the conduits, which makes trenches wider, more expensive. And I think there would be a question as to, would the drinking water state revolving fund that work? I would also want, like Rod kind of alluded to, some level of planning. What size are the conduits? Are there going to be pull boxes and termination boxes? We can't just, we need to terminate them somewhere, I would think. You wouldn't want to just leave them buried, with an open end. I don't know if we have the expertise to do that level of planning. I'm assuming you're talking about fiber optic stuff.
Correct, and I think that since other cities have done that, I might be able to provide that information to you, or the contacts.
That would be great. That would help a lot.
All right.
Yeah.
So Rod and Paul and Pete, I know that you had identified these two projects previously. Can you help us understand why it is suddenly they're back on the docket, number one, and number two, is it common or are we just blessed to have this many projects in the planning phase? That this is a total of 6. We're over $2 million, way over $2 million worth of just planning grants. Could you fill us in on what is customary and then what happened?
Yeah, I think the city's been very lucky when it comes to the planning grants. Of all the clients we've worked with on them, you guys have by far gotten the most.
Are we the most desperate?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I think another part is that through the process of applying for the grants, we were assigned a project manager who was really good. And before we got her, previous project managers had said, and these are on the state level, it said, oh, we don't like those projects, we're not going to entertain those applications. So we proceeded with the 4 that you guys all know about, and then there was some turnover, and when Maureen came on, she said, well, how come you guys aren't applying for these? And we said, well, because you said no. And she said, oh, well, I'll process those. And we said, great. So we resurrected them and got them in, and so they got them funded. So it's a little bit unprecedented, but she's a great project manager, and just the timing worked out. So
Okay, so you feel confident that the construction side of these projects, the grant monies, because of this project manager change, will be forthcoming? Because you were pessimistic before, as you just stated.
well, the planning's one thing, construction is another, right?
Right.
And they are spending the Proposition 1 money like crazy. In fact, they estimate that by this summer, it'll be gone. However, they're already drafting the next ballot measure that would funnel about $275 million additionally into the program. Those kind of bond measures have had a fairly good success of passing in California in the last 20 years, so it's probably likely that the program will be back funded and continue on. So the city just needs to continue with the planning so that when that money's backfilled, the applications are in, and I think it's highly likely you'll get the funding. The nice thing is the state really doesn't want to fund a planning project that doesn't lead to construction. You know, they want to, they're infrastructure bonds. They want to improve infrastructure. So you'll have that going for you.
How did you prioritize on the water distribution system project? What criteria did you use of our dilapidated system to help you decide which was the most dilapidated? Or
It was a team effort for sure. A lot of time with Rod and his staff and Keith and other engineers at Pace. We spent a lot of time walking the streets, going through city records. In general, we're trying to replace small diameter old steel lines that may or may not be in right-of-ways. And, you know, our master plan effort from 2010 identified a number of them, and so we kind of used all those resources and said, okay, these are the highest priority lines.
so something similar to what we saw at Big Lakes, or the project we reviewed
Right.
with you, Keith, in Dunsmuir, those lovely old leaky things. Okay. And one last question I have. You point out that the Spring Hill project would include hydrogeological study.
Right,
As you know, there's been quite a bit of controversy in this community about
right.
the adequacy of scientific studies. Do you have anything you can say about how you will decide to whom you go? What?
Sure, yeah. Our intention is to utilize Lawrence and Associates as a subconsultant to us, and basically their effort will be an all-inclusive review of the studies you mentioned, other existing hydrogeological data, and what we expect to get out of the study is a general feel for the best areas to try to drill a test well. And the planning grant includes the actual drilling of a test well and the testing and sampling and so on, and aquifer testing to determine, you know, what kind of production well the city could get at that location. It also includes an environmental component, and we expect people to be very interested in the project, and that's one reason why the planning grant has, you know, 2.5 years to get through all the steps. So the first step will be that evaluation.
And the project is designed with what goal in mind, the overall project?
Yeah, the project is intended to correct low system pressures that's kind of plagued that Big Lakes area for a number of years, and it was identified in the master plan as being deficient, and we've done subsequent studies evaluating different alternatives, and it turns out that the recommended alternative is to add storage and supply in some capacity in that area of town, because that is the furthest area from your supply and storage. And the only way we could make it work was to build big pipelines from your Springs and Quail Hill tanks all the way across town, which would have been a lot more expensive than a smaller well and a tank in that location, so.
Yeah. So what about all the water in Big Lake? Where does that name come from? Big Lakes?
Good
Anybody
question.
know?
We just pass it along. I don't know. I don't know where that came from.
Thank you.
In terms of the well and holding tank, or water tank up on Spring Hill, that has been part of the city's capital improvement project list for, I want to say decades, but certainly a number of years. And it's the lack of having water lines and water pressure up there that has prevented development up on Spring Hill. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I assume, Tim, that you're probably referring to areas more north of Spring Hill. This project won't serve that area. That would be a higher tank and some type of pumping facility to serve that area to the north of Spring Hill. This tank would be on the south side, and it would really just provide a reservoir level at the same pressure gradient that serves this area of town.
So it will not assist with providing any sort of water access or access to the city's water system for all of those, I want to say hundreds of lots up there on Spring Hill?
No, it won't, and the planning grant wouldn't fund that kind of project anyway. They won't fund growth-type projects. They're funding projects that mitigate existing deficiencies, and that's what we're trying to do here.
All right, thanks.
Anything else of our engineering staff? Okay.
And for the record,
Yes.
it should be noted, this project is called for as a project in your existing general plan.
Thank you, gentlemen, for making the trip up here. I hope we've made it worth your while. Kathy, what resolution number?
CCR-18-04.
04.
Okay. I'll move that,
We have public comment.
oh, public comment, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'd be happy to entertain any public comments on this agenda item at this time. Okay, seeing none. I knew that. We'll then move to a motion, John.
Go ahead.
I'll move that City Council move to approve resolution number CCR-18-04, a resolution of the City Council of the City of Mount Shasta authorizing the city manager to execute task orders with Pace Engineering to complete drinking water state revolving fund planning grant activities.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. Okay, seeing none, we'll move on. Thank you. Okay, item number 9 on our agenda is a community enhancement tax. We look forward to your report, Bruce.
Well, thank you. The council has received numerous requests regarding the concept of placing a community enhancement tax on the ballot for approval by the voters. Basically, all taxes imposed by a governmental agency are either a general tax or a special tax. The proposed enhancement tax, as presently construed, would be a 1/4% increase in local sales and use tax, very similar to what was done for the library. So a community enhancement tax be placed on a ballot can be done either through the council action as a general or a special tax. A general tax requires a 50% approval plus 1 vote. A special tax requires a 2/3 majority vote. General taxes can be placed on general election ballots only. A special tax can be placed on a special election or a general election. Also, it is possible to put a taxing measure on a ballot through voter initiative. Basically, a group of citizens would write a ballot measure. They would take that around to residents, certified voters, get them to sign a petition. That petition would go to the county for verification, and if they reach the required number of signatures, that would then be placed on the ballot. That initiative would require a 50% plus one vote. It is not subject, the voter initiative is not subject to the provisions of 218. So the cost of doing this, it varies. It varies which election you're on and the complexity of the issue. So for a general election, the county has estimated the cost of placing a community enhancement tax on a general election ballot would range between $2,500 and $3,000. The clerk also noted that if we were to place it on a special election, then the cost range could vary from as $3,200 to as high as $30,000. So to get something qualified for ballot from the council perspective, council would have to pass a resolution of the city council with the language in the resolution of what you wanted the measure to be, and forward that to the clerk of the county. If this council wanted to place a community enhancement tax measure on the June ballot, which is a special election, it would have to have the resolution passed and forwarded to the clerk of the board no later than 5 p.m. February 12th, 2018, which is also your next city council meeting. If you were going to go for the November ballot, the general election, then you'd have to have your documents in by the first week of July of 2018 to be on the November ballot. A 1/4% increase in the sales tax, what that will generate will vary depending on the economy. But basically now, I think we would estimate 1/4%, if approved, to generate about $250,000 in revenue per year. If you had $250,000 coming per year, you could bond that money. If you bonded it for 20 years, you would generate between $4 and $5 million in revenue to be expended. Of course, that changes if if interest rates change, as some discussions might happen. The higher rates you pay on bonds, the lower your ultimate yield is. It's all part of the cost. If you were to allocate, if this tax were to pass, and you allocate some of those funds to projects on an annual basis, then that intent would be subtracted from the available funds for bonding. So if you fund one set of projects, you affect your ability to fund other sets of projects. You have in front of you a resolution that the city attorney drafted. We asked him to draft this resolution for tonight because we had a request for consideration of a community enhancement tax to be placed on the June ballot, the special election. If the council were inclined to go this direction, you would have to pass this resolution tonight because you don't have another meeting in time to do it. So that's why we had it drafted. One of the elements you need to remember in this is we're dealing with sales and use tax. Sales and use tax is controlled by the Board of Equalization. This language that we have drafted here, and the language that's could potentially end up in a ballot, would have to go to the Board of Equalization for their approval. If you do not submit it to them and it goes to voters, and if the voters approved it, the board has a history. If the language isn't correct, they won't collect the tax. It all becomes a moot point, kind of a waste of time. So it'd be very critical if your intent was to do this. So if you were to move on this tonight to go on the June ballot with this language, then we would ask that you instruct the city manager to contact the Board of Equalization immediately, forward this language to them. If they okay it, then it goes to the clerk of the board. If they had a problem with it, we would get recommended language, and we would call a special session of the council for consideration. So the item is before you tonight is, are you going to do a community enhancement tax? If so, what ballot do you want to place this on? And do you want to specify the use of these funds, therefore making it required a 2/3 vote? Or do you want this to be a general tax that goes in the general fund subject to an annual appropriation? And those are the questions, the policy issues before you tonight. And I believe we have people here from the museum board and other individuals that are interested in this item.
Thank you, Bruce. Before we go to public comment then, are there questions of Bruce from council members?
Just clarification, so if we were to opt for general tax to go to the general fund for annual appropriation, as you just mentioned, that would require this to be put on the November election, right?
That is correct. And by the way, our city attorney, Mr. Kenny, is here
That's
to make
correct.
sure we do
It would be,
this
it would have to be a
correctly.
general, well, I mean, it has to be a general election. That's, excuse me, the next general election.
So, John, the way this resolution is written, it would be a special tax for community enhancement and economic development, correct?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
So it would not go to the general fund?
Well, I don't know what fund. It would not go to the general fund. I mean, let me say this, it cannot be used for general fund purposes.
So this is a special tax
A
that would
special
be used
tax.
for anything the city, and it's in our infinite wisdom, would decide qualifies for stimulating economic development or improving our quality of life.
Whatever would qualify under that very liberal wording, yes.
Right. And it would be up to the city council to decide that
Absolutely,
on an annual basis.
yes.
Can we put a sunset on it, number one, and can we allocate percentages anywhere?
You can put a sunset on it, yes. When you say allocate percentages, I'm not sure what you mean.
In the wording of,
If we were to, just a second, John, you may have another question. If we were to go the general tax or the general election route and not make it a special tax, not make it a special election subject to 2/3 vote, this is a, and which would require, as I understand it, funds to go to the general fund, and then we would disperse them using a budget process to qualifying and successful nonprofits. Could we say in the ballot measure, because it's coming to the general fund and there might be some concern about our integrity or our ability to pass that money on, could we say we guarantee X percent would go to fund these kinds of activities?
No, because that would be, well, that portion would be a special tax. But let's make something clear here. The revenue on a special tax has to be used for the purposes which are stated in the special tax. And this one, they're pretty broad, okay? But you cannot, by a ballot measure, designate ahead of time who's getting that. It's city money under city's control to be used for those purposes.
So, without going into a comment of mine, what's before us is deciding if we do this, does it make more sense to put it during the general election? Or does it make more sense, which would require 50%, or does it make more sense to do it during a special election in June, which would require 2/3 and would be language similar to what you've written
Yeah,
here?
those are all strategy considerations, that are not for me to
Right,
comment
and
on.
did I say that correctly? Those
yeah,
are the
I think
alternatives before
yeah,
us?
That is
Or
before.
not at all?
Or not at all, and
Yeah.
also the timing when. I mean, you could make it a special tax in November.
Yes.
So
Okay, thank
from a policy standpoint, I think the first policy question you have to come to grips with, you have many uses of money. You have many demands on money. More demands than you have money for, typical government. Is this the highest and best use of those limited funds? That's the question you need to ask, because which way you go here starts to preclude action in other areas, at least potentially. If you think this is one of the highest, best use of funds, and you want to go forward with it, then the question is, do you want to earmark the funds, make it a special election? Do you want to make it general, go in the general fund and go for the general election? So that's how I see the policy issues dropping out that need to be addressed.
What some agencies have done, and I haven't seen it recently, I guess you can still do it, is they put two measures on the ballot. One's a general tax, so that'll raise general fund money. Then the second ballot measure is an advisory measure. It's not binding, but if Measure Blank was passed, would you want certain percentage of the money to go, whatever, the money spent this way. Those aren't binding, but obviously they'd be very politically persuasive if the electorate voted to do something and the city council, while not bound to, chose to do something different.
And the tax side of that would have to wait till November because of,
Yeah, it would have to be at least till November, a general election, yes.
Other questions of staff at this point?
Yes. Was the language of Weed and Dunsmuir used to write this up? Because I know they had some difficulty with the language initially when they went to the ballot. Is this language that?
No, the Weed and Dunsmuir problem wasn't with the ballot measure, it was with the ordinance that enacted it. That's a ballot measure. You also have to pass, recommend, put on the ballot the measure that will actually implement that. And that's where it's not State Franchise Tax Board anymore, it's the Bureau of Tax and Revenue something or other, enhancement, or anyway, they implement it. Basically, it's the state implements a collection of it being a sales tax, and they want to, when they reviewed, I think it was Weeds and Dunsmuir's, they found the ordinance wrong and they had to redo it. So, but what's being proposed is we have sample ballots of theirs, and we would have them approve it before it went on a ballot.
Just,
The other item that you want to keep in mind here is if you decide to go forward with this tax and you decide that you want to go on the November ballot, in your thinking here, realize that the cannabis tax is going to be in November. Parks and Recreation District will probably have a property tax increase on the ballot, and there are state tax increases on that ballot. So that plays into probability of approval.
so when I read this language, it does say improvements to city services. What can this not go to? What kind of things can this not fund that we might want to fund?
What does, pardon me, what does what not fund?
What does this enhancement tax not qualify for funding? What things don't qualify?
Well, let me tell you this. I'm not going to sit here and tell you how you could spend that money. That's not my wording. It's very general. And if you can make a argument that some purpose, that you want to expend it on a purpose that falls within that definition, that's your decision. That could be challenged, but I doubt that it would be. But what you will get obviously is lots of candidates for the expenditure of that money.
And do we have the fund, if the cost to put it on the ballot goes up to $32,000, do we have that money available?
I believe that
If I can answer that.
in the present budget, under city clerk's budget, Merrill, correct me if I'm wrong, there's $10,000 set aside for elections at this time?
That's correct.
We did receive a email from Catherine Wilson. She forwarded an email to us from Colleen Setzer, the county clerk. And Colleen Setzer indicated an estimate of the city's share of cost for a measure on the June ballot would be $3,200.
Really?
So that would fit within the budget that you already have approved for election costs.
Right.
John or Bruce, do either of you have any experience with how long it takes the Board of Equalization to review this kind of, the resolution we would need to put before them before it would go to?
Not this resolution, I mean the measure itself.
Oh, the measure itself, yes,
No.
thank you.
No, I don't know, but they do it as a courtesy. I don't think it would be very long.
Okay. I did talk to Weed Mayor Palfini today, and he said when they made the mistake of wording, it cost them $8,000 to redo it, so.
Well, yeah, but they missed an election too. I think they had to do another election.
Yeah, okay, yes.
Excuse me.
Okay.
So if I understand correctly, also, we would, if we choose to, we would pass the resolution tonight. What has to ultimately go to the county clerk's office is a proposed ordinance. But we talked with Colleen Setzer earlier today. She indicates that we would have until early March to have the city submit the proposed ordinance to her. So this would be the language that would be on the ballot. In the ballot book that voters are able to receive, there's also a proposed ordinance that would cover this.
What you have is the ballot question that they vote on, yes or no. In the ballot pamphlet would be the ordinance that would implement that. And I didn't talk to the clerk, but I'm not used to this procedure, but she says that we have until such and such a time to prepare the ordinance, and I think that it's certainly plenty of time.
I think, do you have another question?
I
Paul?
do. Just for clarification, I had to step outside, had something come up, sorry. So anything that stimulates economic development, would that be a water line to the south end of town or something of that nature?
Well,
Could that be part of it?
could it be? Yeah, I mean, anything in
could be.
the world of, yeah,
We don't have to define it now. We define it when we get it. Is that correct?
let me tell you this, okay, clearly. If you specify a use, it's a special tax. If you don't specify a use, it's a general tax, okay? Special tax, 2/3 vote, general tax, 50% plus one. Now, you have an item there that's very broadly written,
Yeah, it is.
okay?
Okay.
So if it's one thing, hey, you're going to spend it for the library, like the library, that's one thing. I guess an argument could be made that that's so broad, it's a general tax, but so what? If you, to be honest with you, you got a 2/3 vote. If a general tax would only be 50%, so what's the point?
Okay. And there's no sunset on this?
There isn't. You could put one on, but there isn't, but
Okay.
I don't know why If it was a sunset, then when it's sunsetted, you'd have to go back on the ballot to have it extended. Some entities have put them on and then have to go back for the sunset. I don't know of one that was put on and didn't get approved when it was
Okay.
revitalized, I guess you'd say.
Okay. Thank you.
If this community were to go for a citizens initiative to put something on the ballot, would there be any city involvement at all?
No, not really. Let me say this, if they did it as an initiative, in fact, I think our library tax was an initiative, was it not? No, the citizens would have to do what they have to do. There's no city expense. If they got the right number of signatures and the county clerk verified that they had the right number of signatures, then the city council would have two choices: either enact the ordinance or put it on the agenda, on the ballot. You put it on the ballot. There's an argument now that an initiative that promotes a special tax can be passed by a majority vote, majority plus one, because there's a California Supreme Court case says that Prop 218 didn't change the initiative process. Now, that case had to do with a different issue, but the ruling would seem to apply to any Prop 218 question.
So if we were to do this, not using a citizens initiative, if we were to pass either a special tax or a general tax at 1/4%, can you explain to me, Bruce, or perhaps Muriel, what process you would envision using?
Can I make a point? If the citizens place a measure on the ballot, they write it.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily going to be what you have in front of you. They write the measure.
Right. I meant to say that if this weren't a citizens initiative, if we pass either the resolution before us tonight or eventually something that would go on the general election in November, can you share with me what thoughts you may have had in terms of a process that we would use to describe who would be eligible and then how we would select the applying NGOs?
May I comment on that also?
Absolutely.
You cannot promise anybody anything. It's city money to be used for the purposes set forth in if it's a special election, in the initiative. That would come to the city would have, so it's your money like all other city money, and you would have to allocate that on a basis you feel appropriate. Now you say give it to nonprofits. You can fund nonprofits, but of course you have to we're nonprofits ourselves. You can fund nonprofits, but you have to make a finding that it's in the public interest to do so. So you couldn't just say, you have to make a public finding. Then you have to be responsible that the money is used properly. You can't say, hey, pull up your pickup truck and we'll shovel it in the back and good luck. So.
This is all very new, but from my perspective, if you had a tax, a general tax, you have to make the annual allocation. And I'm sure you're going to have many organizations applying for it. Before we get to that point, I think we would bring it to council, set criteria of what is a qualifying agency, with the criteria they have to meet to be qualified to apply, and set some kind of a system to determine which ones to go to. I would like to see, if you're going to do this, that you consider these as part of the budget process. You aren't authorizing or guaranteeing any funds, but you're considering them as part of your budget process and making a decision in that. We would get applications by deadlines, staff would review them, staff would give you their comments, rank order them. Ultimately, the process will be approved by council and the allocation will be approved by council. But we can certainly set a process in place, and I think early in the budget process would be the appropriate place.
There's a model, kind of, it has to be subject to the budget process. There's a model, many agencies use part of their transient occupancy tax for purposes like set forth here. And people apply for it, and you apply for funding under that, and, then normally there's a lot more applications than there is funding available. So it eventually comes back to the city council, and it's like a beauty contest, there's 12 candidates, and you're going to make one friend and 12 enemies.
Or maybe 10 friends and
Yeah,
and two
well,
enemies.
maybe the numbers are wrong, but yeah, there's going to be I would suggest that there's going to be a lot of no's.
I was not part of the initial gathering that was done of a few nonprofits in town several months ago. September. I'm just wondering, if you, in my little bit of inquiring, I understand that a few nonprofits were invited to do this exploration. Are you thinking that other nonprofits that might find themselves interested in this would be solicited with information to participate in applying or for consideration? How would we include what I also agree would be a large number of nonprofits who would want to be considered here? It hasn't been a hugely inclusive process to date, I guess, is the question. Not that it couldn't be, but is there something in mind for that? That's a question. Oh, we can. I didn't know if Bruce and/or John had any information to share.
Well, I mean, it's anybody that could qualify, and you're saying nonprofit, it doesn't have to be nonprofit, it could be anybody. But anybody that could have an argument that they qualify under the use could submit an application. Now, you have to go through a process. Obviously, you have to be careful about how you go through that process, because, all of that's open to challenge. We're a neo-Nazi group, and we have a right to do these things, and you chose not, all of that stuff. But you'd have to set up a process. It doesn't have to be a defensible process. But I don't think it'd be hard to, at the outset, exclude it. I mean, on what basis would you exclude somebody that could say, I'm qualifying under that?
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you for your patience. I see Jeff Harkness's name as having signed up, and if there are others of you who'd like to comment, we'd welcome that as well. Jeff, want to come up, please?
Thank you very much for taking public comment on this. For the record, my name is Jeff Harkness, resident of the city of Mount Shasta, and representing the museum as a board member. The museum strongly encourages you to place the community enhancement tax on the June ballot. We believe the community enhancement tax will spur economic development by supporting many local nonprofits and quasi-government agencies. I think it is a very good use of your taxing power, your power to tax, and also, to Bruce's question, one of the highest uses of these funds. And let me explain. And let me just start with the museum, just as an example, but I'll provide some other examples also. Personally, I believe that this tax can benefit the museum, and in return, the museum can continue to benefit the community. The museum has been a draw for tourists for decades, bringing in visitors and encouraging them to spend money locally in the community. The quality of the museum has been enhanced substantially over the last 10 years, and that is something that we're proud of, although that does take a budget, as with anything, to support. We are worried that our future expenses will increase as payroll increases in the future. And on that front, we have entertained the idea of doing a citizens initiative, asking the residents of Mount Shasta to support a 0.25% tax specific to the museum, much like the library did with the 0.25% tax. However, we're not inclined to take that step alone at this time, but we are encouraged by the thought of a community enhancement tax. The community enhancement tax has potential to support many organizations, and this community has struggled with economic development in the past, and I think one way to think about this community enhancement tax is much like a research and design budget if this were a corporation. The ability to have funds to outsource economic development to other quasi-government agencies and local nonprofits. For example, I think along with the museum, you have other nonprofits that have been doing quite good, substantial work, whether that be the Trails Association, whether that be the ice rink, and then if we take a look at some of your own committees that are currently asking for funds from the general fund, such as the ATC, such as the Beautification Committee. And then you also have other organizations that have been taking funds, requesting funds from the general fund for years, including the Chamber of Commerce, including the EDC. So I think one way to think about this, and I will wrap up, I do notice my time is up. One way to think about this is that you will be creating a budget to support these economic activities of local nonprofits and quasi-government agencies, and protect yourselves from pilfering from the general fund. Currently, we think the time is right to put it on the June ballot. Given the number of community organizations that this can support, we believe that the 2/3 hurdle is achievable by stimulating the support from the public. This touches many organizations, many of our local citizens.
Thank you, Jeff. Any other comments from those of you in the audience? Yes.
My name is Geneva Oman. I live in Hammond Ranch, and I am on the board of directors that oversees the Mount Shasta Community Resource Center. And I would like you to consider using this type of a community enhancement fund for efforts that help enhance and build and strengthen our community members. The Community Resource Center works a lot with families. We do parent education. We do play groups for young kids, 0 to 5, who come in with their parents. The parents do a lot of networking during that time. We have programs for seniors. We've been working with youth. We have been working on substance abuse prevention. We are doing things to help empower individuals and families within our community to develop the skills to become more active community participants. We have some job training programs that helps these members to participate more in our economy. And I would say if you are going to be thinking about this as an economic development fund, then don't call it a community enhancement tax, call it an economic development tax. I think there are so many ways we can help strengthen individuals and families within our community that help with our economic development, that it's important to look at the kinds of programs that do that. The Mount Shasta Community Center has been operating here. I think we're in our 12th year now, providing services across the entire age spectrum for our community members. So bear that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
May you make a comment, Jenny? Jenny?
Geneva. It's
Janine, the proposal is to stimulate economic development and to enrich the local quality of life.
Those could be some very competing and not necessarily complementary.
So the funds could be used for the sorts of things that you're talking about.
The name of the tax is just the name of the tax. It doesn't have any specific meaning. So
I think before we go to council discussion, as I understand it, those of you in the audience haven't seen this wording. Is that correct? Let me just read the one paragraph. I think it would be helpful. Whereas, excuse me, whereas the tax provided by the proposed ordinance shall be used exclusively to provide funding that stays within the Mount Shasta community and cannot be seized by the state, to enrich our local quality of life and to stimulate economic development, which may fund such programs and activities as the Sisson Museum, bike, pedestrian, and mountain biking trails, art, music, and cultural activities, youth programs, senior programs, and improvements to city services. That's how it's currently worded. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
it only can list purposes. It can't list an agency. You can't have a ballot measure that says we're going to take our taxing money and give it to some agency.
The specific language that would be on the ballot is as follows. To provide funding that stays in the Mount Shasta community and cannot be seized by the state, to enrich our life locally and to stimulate economic development, which may fund such programs and activities as the Sisson Museum, bike and pedestrian and mountain biking trails, art, music, and cultural activities, youth programs, senior programs, and improvement of the city services, shall the city of Mount Shasta adopt a 1/4 cent sales tax, providing approximately $250,000 annually, mandatory audits, and consistent community reporting.
I would not, I don't know exactly what your agency does, but I would be surprised you couldn't fall within that definition somehow.
But you said you can't.
I can't, you cannot.
But it's listed as Sisson Museum, and that is.
Yeah, well, they're saying as a possibility. That doesn't say, it's not designated for them. And I'm sure the Sisson Museum understands that they have no greater claim for this money other than politically.
You know, I think this is exemplary of a number of organizations that would like to have their names included in here, first five. It would go on and on. So your point is well heard. Okay, thank you. Okay, council discussion.
And she did mention job programs, which could be specified.
Council discussion.
I also support putting this on the June ballot, even though it requires a 2/3 vote instead of a 50% plus one vote in November. The library tax was put on the June ballot. And because of the dynamics of a June ballot, you actually tend to have fewer people voting in a June election than you do in the general election in November. Typically, the people who vote in the June election are those who have a special interest in voting in June. That's probably why the library was able to get a 77% approval rate when they only needed 2/3. I do understand there's going to be other tax measures in November, and frankly, I think with November, you got more people voting. If there's a lot of tax measures and controversial issues, there's a lesser chance of having this type of measure passed. And also, if we put it on the June ballot and we work really hard and we only get 65 or 66 or 55 or 45% in the June ballot, we still have Plan B. We can still have the option of trying to put it on the November ballot. So we essentially get 2 bites of the apple if we put it on the June ballot.
Question for John. John, if we were to change this to a specific dedicated cause, say we wanted to do this 1/4 sales tax for the purposes of enhancing the city library and more quickly pay off its expansion, that sort of specificity, would that be allowed? Because it happened in the past. We can't mention particular non-governmental organizations in this.
You can state a purpose, a specific purpose.
But the
what you
library
can't do
tax-
is dedicate, what you have to be careful about is attempting to dedicate your taxing power to some other agency. So
But,
if you,
but if it's part of the city, but when the library tax was passed, that was dedicated to a particular,
Right.
institution. So that was okay, right?
yeah, you can dedicate you could dedicate the tax to museum purposes,
Right.
okay?
We could isolate it down to the museum.
Yeah, sure.
But you couldn't say the Sisson Museum.
I would not, no, I don't think you can do that, because then the Citizens Museum comes in and says, hey, where's my $250,000? You gave it to me. The voters gave it to me.
So it's purposes versus.
Correct.
Yeah.
Do either of you have any comments, Paul, Barbara?
I mean, we have some incredible, wonderful organizations who are worthy and who do help with the economy. I know that. And the Resource Center is a wonderful place. They do great work. Museum does great work. City needs a lot of stuff. We have, the infrastructure's falling apart. And as I understand it, if we wanted to just do infrastructure with this, we could. So it gives us a lot of options, and it doesn't mean that this year we can't give this organization so much, and next year we give the city so much to build a water line somewhere. So it does give us flexibility, is the way I read this. So I don't know. I just, I think we're going to have to be creative. We're going to have to, what's our priorities? I mean, there's so many places that we need money right now. And I think we're going to have to prioritize as a council to where this goes. That's a decision we don't have to make tonight. But I think that I think if we vote yes for it, we'll find some wonderful places to put this money, and it might be infrastructure this year, or next year, or the year after. And the library, or the museum, and the resource center the following years, I don't know. But I just want to make that clear, that that's the way I read this, is we can go any which way we want to. So.
And my concern is that have we shown as a council, and the council changes, obviously, every couple of years, so are we going to be the group to really review how this money is going to be distributed? Are we the best group to do it, or is the staff the best group to do it? I see the funds coming into the library, but I haven't seen the council be active as far as youth programs and senior programs that are mentioned here. There's some money that we could actually have some say as far as how that money is used, but we haven't stepped up to the plate to do that. So are we the best, is the council the best person to decide how this money is distributed, or would it be more appropriate to assign a group of citizens to do that, as an advisory group, for example?
If I can answer that question, that specific question. Because tax revenues are city money, the city has to decide how the revenues will be spent. You can have advisory groups that would advise, but it would be the city, the council, that would have to decide. So, for example, if let's just say beautification committee said, we'd like to have $5,000 to water the hanging baskets as a beautification effort.
Yeah, we're talking $200 versus $250,000. This is $250,000 every year to decide where it goes, how it's spent, and, are we the deciders here? Are we?
Yes.
We would be the deciders.
Yes.
And then have we shown that we're active? Have we proven that we're active in distributing city money? For example, with the library tax, have we been involved in deciding, or do we assign a standing committee to do the research, advise us, and then we pretty much take their advice? So how active have we been in really discovering what organizations merit money, how organizations drive, what direction they're driving, et cetera? I haven't seen that we are that active in that.
As a council in the past, for the years that I've been on the council, we've typically had the city staff come to us and say, this is how much it's going to cost to run the city. There's about $16,000 or $10,000 or some very small amount that's left over that you, city council, can decide what to do with in your discretion. And so we have not been in a position to say we want to be able to grow the economy of Mount Shasta, to enrich the quality of life in Mount Shasta, because there has been really a lack of funding to do anything other than fund the everyday activities that staff has presented to us in the annual budgets. This is, there was a program a couple years ago down in Davis, I'm told, where they really strongly recommended having a community enhancement tax to help the community. In Ashland, of course, we know that Oregon doesn't have any sales tax, but Ashland adopted a special tax that it uses for beautification and enhancement purposes. It's what apparently funds the plaza, it funds the hanging baskets, it funds various tourist-related activities. And we all love going to Ashland to enjoy those sorts of things. If this were to be put on the ballot and if it were to pass, this would give Mount Shasta community that opportunity.
Ashland's built itself over 20, 30 years of,
Yeah.
you know, it's not, money is not always a solution. That's what I said.
Thank you. John, do you have any comments?
Yeah, this is to Bruce and Muriel. How much money do we send to organizations like the Chamber of Commerce per year? Do you know off the top of your head? Is it 25,000? 65,000. And then the Economic Development Corporation up in council gets another 25. And then all the rest, do anybody have any idea combined what we send to organizations? Is it 10 to 15 combined? So we're pushing $100,000 in city money going to non-governmental organizations, nonprofits at this point. Well,
So I would,
I would be more comfortable if the language included that going forward, if this were to be passed, that the quarter-cent sales tax would be an upper limit, whatever that number came in each year, to donations from the city, grants from the city to these non-governmental organizations. If that's allowable, it would be a restriction on.
Let's back up a minute, okay? All of the money, the question is, can you have an advisory committee? You can have an advisory committee and you can have letters from the public and kids come in, but the point of the matter is it's going to be a city council decision how you spend that money, just as it is right now with these monies, your funds you're giving out. So you say, well, can we have a rule to limit ourselves? I mean, can we, stop me before I kill again? Is it one of those? I mean,
Yeah.
you have the right,
It's a good idea.
every year when you do your budgeting to decide where city money is going and to whom. Not only the right, but the obligation.
So,
But the city manager was proposing that we eliminate giving funds to private nonprofits entirely because of budgetary constraints, and we tabled that.
and your city manager has not changed his recommendation.
Right. So
But that is,
yeah.
that is only the city manager's recommendation, so keep that in perspective. Back to your question you just posed, Councilman Stackpeth. If we were to go for this, and if it were to pass, this council could adopt a policy. This is the fund we use for all these categories, and they all have to apply annually. Then you, the council, decide which ones and to what degree.
And I'm asking why couldn't we include that language in this proposal, this proposition?
Let me run, you want to put in the proposition no, you can't, that would be, whatever revenues come from this source would be exclusively, the only money exclusively
Okay, so it would have to be a separate
Yeah, I don't believe you
proposition
can do
then.
that. You can't delegate your responsibilities.
Well,
As a practical matter, of course, you could do it every year when you're budgeting, but There's
So are
nothing.
you saying that in this state or in this city, we cannot put constraints, budgeting constraints?
Yeah, every year, you do it every year when you do a budget. You can't ask the electorate to do it by a ballot measure.
Why not? Are you sure that that can't be done? The electorate can't tell a city government that we would like you to budget according to certain,
They can tell that,
Limitations?
but they can't compel it. I mean, eventually, the electorate can't enact any legislation that the city council themselves couldn't enact. So if this city council said that, for now on, the city forever will only spend $100,000 for this purpose, I don't think that would be enforceable. Another city council could come along and do something else.
John, doesn't this kind of fall in the category, the constitutional prohibition about delegating authority,
Correct?
and that city funding is subject to an annual appropriation, and that's why when we do city financing bonds, there is a annual appropriation requirement in those bonds, because you cannot, correct me if I'm wrong, this council cannot bind future councils in terms of budget appropriations.
When you get into bonding and municipal financing, it's a whole new set of games. But the reality is, and usually there's what they call the special fund doctrine. You can designate the revenues from a special fund, but you cannot obligate the general fund. So in bonding, the city could make a commitment to repay that they wouldn't have to follow. Their credit would go in the toilet. But
Okay, thank you.
Just a clarification. No? So currently, we pay the chamber out of the general fund, so if we use this enhancement tax to pay the chamber, then it frees up money in the general fund, is that what I'm understanding?
well, the money in the general fund is free right now. If you choose in this budget to give the chamber $25,000 out of, that's general fund money, I presume it's from the transient occupancy tax, I don't know, it's general fund money.
It's general fund money, and the Chamber of Commerce is contracted. There's an actual contract that the council has approved that at this point comes out of the general fund. Same could be said for the Siskiyou Economic Development Council, same sort of thing. It would be up to the council to decide what this tax money is used for. So the question would be, does the Chamber of Commerce and Siskiyou Economic Development Council fit into the specifications that you've talked about for this type of tax? And I would say it probably would.
Well, if those of you in the audience can't tell, this is a complex issue about which we've given a lot of thought. I would be surprised. Personally, this is one of the most difficult issues and opportunities I've had the chance to weigh in on. I think there's no question that we could do this, but the better question is, should we do it, given our fiscal and otherwise responsibilities to our community. I think in terms of the reasons for doing this, I firmly believe, and I think that's been proven by the number of organizations I've invited to come and present to us what their missions are. There are many, many organizations in our town that have contributed to the quality of life and continue to do so, given remarkable board members, remarkable volunteers, remarkable business support, and the support of the council. A city is a lot more than its local governance council and its staff, and I recognize that. And I would say that Mount Shasta's, in particular, our vitality in large part has been due to those of you who work on behalf of all of those organizations. There are many who contribute to quality of life, trails, parks, educational facilities, and then there are others that are aimed at the portion of our residents who have little resilience. The seniors, our poorer residents, it crosses the gamut here. There's wonderful work happening on behalf of all of us. So all those constitute for me reasons to go forward on this. The reasons why not to, for me, go back to the initial question, which was, what's the highest and best use of the money that we bring in now and could bring in with this? To me, and this is where my fiscal conservativeness, I guess, will come out, but only the city can and is responsible for delivery of essential services. The water, sewer, public safety, the roads, and every taxpayer has the right to expect us to do the best we can with the revenues that we bring in. We have, as you know, if you have followed us at all, we have a huge, estimated to be over $50 million backlog in infrastructure, basic delivery systems to our residents. We have some challenging staffing issues, including in the public safety arenas, very challenging. Those services people expect us to continue for very good reasons. I believe if we were to do this, we would need to design an application process or something that would help us make decisions come budget time. And that would take staff time. So would the sorting through the criteria. So would it be a lot of time on the part of those applicants to talk to us about what the rate of return is, or return on investment. How is it you specifically would be able to contribute to the quality of life and enrichment of our community? All kinds of very specific things that would help us decide. Right now, it's hard for me to think about how I'm going to support seniors and youth programs over educational programs that the museum provides. It's a very broad area here. The timing of it, as you've pointed out, is that we did just raise utility rates, and we do have plans. No, I mean, you pointed out that we're putting cannabis and maybe the recreation and parcel tax on the November ballot. So that's a timing issue. As is, more correctly to say, as is the fact that we just raised utility rates. So my biggest concern is what happens in this volatile regional and local and national economy if the bottom falls out of something that would enable us to provide essential services, and we feel compelled to go to the voters and ask for a transaction tax that would allow us to provide much needed, I don't know, whatever it would be. So I think if I had to choose or die right now, which apparently I do, I'm going to come down on the side of not supporting this because I fear that the voters would not support another tax that we ask for, that we need in order to do only what the city can do, which is to provide those essential services. And I would ask that those organizations who are looking to take advantage of this, and if I were on your board, and I have been supporters of your organizations, I'm members of all of your organizations, I would be saying the same thing you are. But in this hat, with this hat on, I can't justify the risk we would be taking. So those are my comments at this point.
I understand your comments. I can also tell you from history that taxpayers have almost universally voted down tax measures that are for everyday governmental expense. Voters don't vote in favor of those tax measures. So if you're concerned about holding that in the pocket in case we'll need it in the future, history says that's not going to be the sort of thing that flies. One of the nice things about this sort of sales tax measure is that we are a tourist economy. We are a tourist destination town. And most of the tax revenue we get from sales tax is from visitors. So, for example, in some other towns, they have found that perhaps as much as 87% of the tax revenue, sales tax revenue, was paid by people outside of the jurisdiction rather than by the locals. When we talk about raising tax revenue for the community good, we are essentially enjoying those revenues from people who are coming to visit Mount Shasta, and we are giving back to those visitors and future visitors through enhancing the community.
Okay, so to city manager and city council, just for clarification, this is written so broadly that were to pass and we were to decide to bond this revenue, by my calculations, the calculators I use, it could be worth about $4 million. We could, under the stimulate economic activity, use it for practically any infrastructure project we thought appropriate. That's question number one. As a council, we could decide to do that. Your opinions? Yeah.
In my opinion, yes, you could. Put it in context, extending sewer and water to the landing would cost around
That's exactly what I'm thinking.
And the other, we talked about addressing the infrastructure that exists and needs attention, needs
Earlier
upgrading,
today,
repair.
yeah.
Just to analyze the existing infrastructure to come up with a program, a plan of what is needed to be done. Just the study would cost $2 million.
200,000?
Million. That was a proposal from Pace Engineering.
200 million?
It was $1 million, just under $1 million, 9 something.
Oh,
To
$1
do
million
the
dollars
full-
to do the study of
Yeah.
the infrastructure problems,
Yeah.
right?
And then you would have, based on today's inadequate numbers, probably $50 million worth of improvements to make.
Okay, and so the other question I had was, just for clarification, the city would retain the responsibility and duties of managing this money, and we could opt to limit our grants to non-governmental organizations or private nonprofits to these funds. We would have that option, and we would be under no obligation, but it sounds like we might be because we have contracts with the Chamber of Commerce. Are they renewed yearly, or is it a longer-term contract?
They're a multi-year contract that you make an appropriation to.
But after that, we could fold them into this tax?
You could-
I mean, that option would be available?
That contract can
Okay.
be amended, it can be done away with, that's totally within the purview
Because at
of
this
your
point,
authority.
if you were to spend all the $250,000 on private nonprofits, plus what we send to the Chamber and the Economic Council, it'd be approaching $350,000.
If you
And
took-
at that point, that's about 10% of our operating budget as it currently stands, $3.5 million. I don't know if 10%, that's a high percentage. I don't know enough about local governments and what they allocate. Seems a little high to me.
So if this measure passed, and if it generated $250,000, and if I understood you correctly, if you took that $250,000 and add to that what we're presently funding private organizations, our finance director estimated approximately 100,000. Yeah, you're at $350,000 a year that this council could allocate.
The council could also use some of these funds, if this were to pass, to perhaps help fund some retrofitting for the armory if the National Guard does move down to Reading this year. The city owns the armory. There's been a proposal to that building would be given, the use of the building would be given back to the city. The lease would be given up. Roger Emerson and others are interested in having that become a performing arts forum for the city. So some funding could be used for that. So there's multiple purposes. It's not as though.
No, I'm just trying to get to the point that I just want a clarification on those contracts to those two organizations I mentioned, whether they were year to year or actually they're 3-year contracts. What kind of flexibility the city council will have in utilizing this $250,000?
Muriel, I'd
So-
like to recognize you.
if
She's had
the-
her hand up
if
for a
this were
while.
to-
Tim, let me, and then you can speak. Muriel's had her hand up for a while.
I didn't mean to be rude.
Me either.
Go ahead.
I think that there are several ways to look at this, council members. The allocation, we're looking at approximately $250,000 coming into the city. That could be, the actual $100,000 from the general fund could be shifted to this community enhancement fund because it fits into that type of funding, thereby saving the general fund $100,000. $100,000 would come out of the 250. You'd have $150,000 left to do with what you like. So there are a lot of different ways to look at this. We could sit here all night and talk about all the different types of. You'd have a matrix of different ways in which to figure out how to spend this money. I think that the issue at hand is. If the council has interest in pursuing this type of tax, and if the taxpayers of the city of Mount Shasta and the people who visit the city of Mount Shasta are interested in paying that extra 0.25%. I think that's what it comes down to.
That's what I was going to say, but you said it so much better.
So I want to clarify, it says Mount Shasta community. Are you talking about the city limits? Because the museum we know is in the county, and the Parks and Rec is a special district. So are you saying that this fund does not qualify for special districts, and it's okay for organizations in the county?
What this is saying is that the council would be able to decide where this money would go, whether they're within the city limits or not. I think the key is there a benefit to the citizens of Mount Shasta, which I would say that the museum certainly has, as well as some of the other things that you've mentioned. So it would fit very well into that.
If I may, there was a mention of bonding, and I hope no one's considering using this fund as a mechanism of bonding, because I doubt that could happen.
I would move approval of resolution number CCR 18-05.
Is there a second?
I second.
I would propose some amendments of language, adding job programs to youth programs and senior programs.
I would accept that amendment. Where would that go?
How
After,
about youth, jobs, and senior programs? Yeah.
You also mentioned education. I mean, you said museum is automatically educational, but
I think cultural would be education. I just think, yeah, I think so. I think we're.
I think I'm good.
Go ahead. I think cultural, education would fall under that. I think it's so broad. Youth programs, I mean, you can have an educational youth program. I don't think we have to specifically say that. But jobs, I'm fine with that.
So are we, is one of the things that I heard, are we thinking that, given the breadth of the wording here, that this measure, if approved by the voters, would be the best opportunity to fund not only the needs of several applying nonprofits, but also some of the highest city services, that this would be the best way to get any funding, because, as you said, voters tend not to vote for city-specific things. Is that a conclusion we're drawing?
as long as it falls within the categories, the descriptions.
The voters can give the city, this is getting confusing. What was the concern about the voters can't do something with the city?
Could some of the revenue be used for city needs?
That this, is this indeed?
If it could be used, let's be candid, okay? The measure is written to attract as much support as possible, all right? We know that. Now, the question is, you can use, if you want to spend money, if you could find that it fits under any of those definitions, I would say that's an appropriate expenditure of that money. If you're using it as a substitute for general city revenues, then, you know, then you've got, then it's okay, but you've got a question about integrity with the voter. I mean, this tax measure, I understand, it's called a community enhancement, whatever, but the idea is, I think, is that the sales pitch is that it's going to raise money for various entities, or organizations or whatever, that does things that the city council determines at budget time enhances the city. I don't think the idea is as the source of revenue to substitute for city revenues.
But as Muriel pointed out, to the extent that we are funding private organizations or other government agencies or quasi-government agencies to the tune of $100,000, that might conceivably, if a council were to decide, that could free up $100,000 for regular city
I think that's
services.
true. If you're already funding out of city funds that, I think it would be okay to replace that with these special revenues.
So I've talked with Mount Shasta Trail Association. They aren't particularly interested in being considered, and the Land Trust either. And Recreation and Parks is doing their own thing, and which is great.
I heard differently from, I just heard differently from Land Trust, so it's unclear for me. I heard both sides.
Okay, I talked.
It's
okay.
all moot until and unless this were to
Right.
pass.
Right. Okay, any other discussion?
Call for a vote?
Anybody want to take my place up here?
You do have a motion and a second
I know.
before you.
I know, thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? I'll go with an aye. Thank you. I'm for.
Is that a unanimous?
Could,
Great.
if I may,
Excellent.
could I ask that the city council also authorize the city manager to make any clerical corrections that may be needed in this ballot measure, because I don't know what the county
So-
clerk's going to say, and
So move.
So would we need to schedule a
Is there a second?
special meeting?
I will second that clarification.
So discussion, you had talked about the need to schedule a special meeting. Should we get feedback from the Board of Equalization that the wording wasn't correct?
if we need a special meeting, we can alert you to that.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, we have a motion and a second.
Okay, I thought it was an amendment to the initial, no, okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
No, I guess that's it. Wait. There was something else. Ad hoc. That's not us, huh? If okay, I'll excuse myself now, and it's been more than a little bit of fun.
Yes, thank you very much, John. Wow. Okay, we took a mini recess without announcing it, but we are reconvening now to listen to the great item we have on the agenda. Those of you in the audience, can we have your attention, please? We're going to move on now to agenda item number 10, the Housing Ad Hoc Committee Report. Can we hear from you, Juliana?
Yes, and it will be riveting. So the City Council put together an ad hoc committee late last year to discuss the constraints that were existing in the housing market. So this is based off of the experience of a shortage housing for affordable home ownership and rental units. Households wishing to move to the city have had difficulties finding housing options and affording the units that the area has available. This can be attributed to a number of housing market factors like decreased speculation. I don't know what's vibrating over here, I'm really sorry. Which could be factors like decreased speculation after the recession or developers' inability to produce affordable units. The 2014 housing element, which we did a review of that will be later in this report, briefly visits the possible constraints to developing more housing in the city limits. The listed constraints are based on basic housing market factors with little insight into real issues with the housing market. This is why we put the ad hoc committee together, was to try and dig in a little bit more in depth into those constraints. So before we can do this, something we brought up with the work plan is defining the term affordability. It means a lot of different things depending upon the person that you're talking to or using the word. So the City of Mount Shasta's ability to improve its housing market will be determined by which definition of affordability we use. And so in the previous City Council meetings, we talked about the federal definition is no more than 30% of a household's income is spent on housing payments. This can be mortgage payments or rental. And then for the state of California, they get slightly more in depth, and my office is required to report on these levels every year. But affordable in the state of California is concerned with no more than 30% of low income, very low income, and extremely low income households. The income levels are determined by a percentage of an area's median income for a given year, and it's important to understand the difference between all of these definitions as we work to address barriers to the housing market. So you'll see there is a income level and the monthly payments we associate with each one, going from extremely low to moderate as you move down the box. And I don't have the agenda packet on me, so I don't know exactly what page it is, but it's page 2 of that staff report.
Page 90.
Thank you. I will have that for future reference. So yeah, on page 90, there's that table. The table is based off of the 2016 monthly payments for housing at 30% of the various income levels. Our median income for 2016 is $39,777, which is slightly lower than 2015. This table was used throughout the report to discuss the various income levels, so when you see us referencing low income, very low income, or extremely low income, that's what we're talking about. The City Council had talked about looking at moderate to extremely low payments. So moderate is looking at people in at least somewhat education-based jobs, medical field, government, things like that, where the low to extremely low income is associated more with service-based jobs. So the constraints can be identified a number of different ways. We chose to do housing studies and stakeholder outreach. And a copy of the work plan that we followed is on page 91. So I'm going to skip right to the results, basically. The housing element constraints that we reviewed are divided into 2 sections. One is governmental constraints and one is non-governmental constraints. It's really important to note that governmental constraints are things that you as a legislative body, city staff, put onto the housing market. They're easily changed because we're the ones in control of them. So these are your development regulations, your zoning code, any extra building codes that are put onto these entities trying to develop housing. Non-governmental constraints are basically loan rates of the area, land cost, construction cost, outside state and federal regulation. These are things you have a very difficult time changing or have no ability to change. So as we go, higher scrutiny and the need for more upfront investment from builders is one of the things mentioned in the loan rates area, so that kind of touches on that. So those, we kind of had, like I said, a more basic economics of a housing market. So as you develop more land in the city, land costs rise because the supply of land is not there. It doesn't really pinpoint what exactly is happening in the housing constraint area. We did confirm that construction cost and land costs that were brought up in the non-governmental constraints were also echoed in the interviews, as we'll see. So we did housing sector interviews as part of our stakeholder outreach. And so the 4 various areas that we looked at were building and development sector, financing, real estate, and property management. The team was able to interview at least one individual from each sector, but found it difficult to meet with multiple builders and financing agents. So the financing agents piece, we just don't have that many in the area, and so it's difficult to pinpoint a lot of them. But the bigger issue that is one of the major constraints that we found was the building sector relationship. It was apparent from conversations with builders while trying to schedule meetings and input from one builder interviewed that the city and building community do not have a positive relationship. People actually told me on the phone that they would not like to meet with me, just plain and simple. Comments about the relationship indicate the building community does not trust the city due to hidden fees known as ghosting and inflexibility of city policies. So ghosting is a term used to describe a situation where unforeseen fees, processes, and rules are applied to a project after the fact. So the one builder we did interview echoed this for a project he was on where they found some piping in the ground that they were liable to take out of the ground. Certain situations where one department is satisfied with a plan but another isn't, and so that delays the project, that adds additional costs and procedures that weren't initially budgeted for. This is a huge issue. A lot of builders don't want to build in a city where they're going to be kind of led around and delayed and have a lot of extra costs that they can't put into the initial budget. So the one builder we did have, as I said before, there was a pipe situation that would not have necessarily killed the project if it was divulged on the front end, but it's something that they would have liked to know because it does add time and cost. In addition to unforeseen requirements, the inflexibility of city policies was a common theme for most interviewees, not just the builder. Interviewees stated that city policies did not allow for the development of alternatives. For example, flexibility dealing with properties that may have issues that other properties don't. There was a comment about substandard housing that was brought up in Planning Commission about previous examples of someone trying to build on a slightly substandard lot, so it was maybe slightly too small for our zoning code, but it was a perfectly good lot for housing. So the thing that we heard was the policies were developed in a black and white fashion, or a perceived black and white fashion, which translated to a do as we say or get out of the office attitude. This perceived attitude of the city in combination with the unpredictable nature of building costs have degraded the city-building relationship. This is something that I'll address in the recommendations as being something we really do need to work on, because it's your single-family duplex and triplex housing is typically built by individuals in your regional area. And so if they're not willing to build here, you're not getting those housing sector areas. So going into it, talking about housing demand, we based it off of perceived demand. So we did ask some questions about what people felt was selling or going for. So the most demanded price point for homes is $250,000 or less with a 2 or 3 bedroom configuration. That was pretty common. Homes between $250,000 and $500,000 sell at a slightly less demanded rate, and then any home listed over $500,000 has a difficult time selling. The demand for rental units is high all around, regardless of price point and type categories. Typically, a lot of people talked about 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. And for rental units, 2 bedroom, 2 bathroom is the highest rated thing. So major constraints that came out. So like I said, the primary purpose of the team was to identify these constraints. What we found was the overall building costs, connection and school fees, and increasing state building standards were the largest 3. Building costs associated with the building code, land costs, and materials is the largest constraint said by every single person that we interviewed. The changes to state of California building code have led builders to include improvements that can be costly. For example, all new residential units must have a fire sprinkler system, perpetual fans in bathrooms, and temperate glass for homes in urban wildland interfaces. Included in the building costs is the initial cost of land. Land costs are higher in the city of Mount Shasta city limits than anywhere else in South County. This was echoed by our interviewees, and if you just take a look at blank sales on any type of real estate website, they're higher. It's a fact. These land costs can be attributed to the location of the city. So one of the things we gleaned out of the interviews that is a positive thing for us, depending on how you view it, is that people are willing to pay higher for the city of Mount Shasta in their address line, point blank. That's what most of the real estate agents had told us, is people initially come and say, I want to live in the city of Mount Shasta, and if they can't afford it, they usually go to the surrounding area in the county, or they go to Shastina. People who come to this area really want it for the unique landscape, the scenic views. They're willing to pay the price to live here, which it can be a positive thing that we can leverage in the future. And there's just a lot of natural capital things to do. So potential clients, like I said, are willing to pay more for that. As I stated before, the next comparable location for potential buyers and renters who cannot afford Mount Shasta is Lake Shastina. Lake Shastina has the additional benefit of having newer housing, and that was something said with the builder, is that people are looking for high quality, well-kept housing, and that's for renters as well as homeowners. The second constraint, part of those overall costs to build in Mount Shasta, is the city connection fees and school fees have risen at a high rate and remain at high levels. The city connection fees for water and sewer have risen sharply to keep up with the infrastructure needs. These connection rates have risen at such a high rate that many builders cannot create market rate housing units. A recent city council policy has lowered the connection rates, which are seen as very positive by all of the interviewees, and many requested that the connection rates remain low for additional time. In addition to the connection fees associated with new housing units, the interviews stated that the per square foot school fee is the highest allowable rate in the state of California. The current rate is $3.36 per square foot for residential developments. This fee, partnered with connection fees, creates a financial barrier to providing lower income housing units. So when we talk about the connection fees and school fees, people are willing to pay them, but the people who are developing properties for extremely low, very low, and low income cannot make the monthly rent payments with those fees associated to that. So they're not necessarily a constraint to all housing development, but they are a significant constraint to any low to extremely low income housing. Finally, the last major constraint to constructing is, as stated previously, is building requirements for the state of California. Mentioned above, the increase in residential building requirements increases the overall cost to build. Many interviewees mentioned that the new requirements make creating low-income units impossible in the city limits. The interviewees did realize that the city has little to no influence over the changes in building code regulations, and there are no recommendations in place to address this constraint. We don't have the lobbying ability to change the state of California building codes. That's just something we have to kind of come to terms with. So the Planning Commission of the City of Mount Shasta discussed the Housing Discovery Report during our January 16th, 2018 regular meeting. The Planning Commission discussed the findings of the report and offered the following suggestions: an assessment of possible city properties for housing development and promotion of flexible minimum housing square footages for various residential zones. And something that was stressed by one of our commissioners, which kind of partners with our previous item on the agenda, is there is a huge concern for infrastructure. They did discuss an infrastructure assessment and investment to prevent future constraints to what the city can provide as far as housing options. A while back, there was a moratorium on all development because our infrastructure could not handle it, and that is a concern that the Planning Commission did have. The only formal recommendation that was made by a unanimous Planning Commission is to include a final report to City Council. To include in this report was an assessment of the short-term rental market. So this topic did come up in some of our interviewee conversations. It's not something that I had initially provided a recommendation on, and I did that on purpose. So short-term rentals are a complex topic. I mean, the housing market in general is a complex topic, but short-term rentals adds a different dynamic. It adds the economic benefit dynamic. So when we talk about short-term rentals and trying to balance that out with the housing needs, you have to really look at where you're getting your revenues from. Most of your revenue is from transient occupancy tax, which is charged to short-term rentals and hotel rooms. And that is the major part of your budget right now. So if you're cutting down on short-term rental, on the legal short-term rental market, and you're putting in more housing, you're gonna see that TOT number go down. And if you're okay with that, that's fine. But the reason why I didn't put this in for this discussion is we're just trying to talk about the constraints of the housing market and not necessarily talk about the merits or direction of short-term rentals or the economy of the city of Mount Shasta. It's difficult to peel those two apart, but I think it's something that needs to be considered on the side. So we do also charge bed and breakfasts as well in that. So I think that regulating the short-term rentals based on this report is premature at this time. The City Council and Planning Commission will need more information related to the costs and benefits of short-term market regulations. The Planning Commission has recommended more investigation into the motivations of those who engage in short-term rentals before recommending permanent changes to regulations. Again, like I said, this has a huge impact on your economic situation for the city. You are a tourism-based economy, and I don't, like I said, I do not recommend any permanent changes at this time because it is a complex topic. So we divided the staff recommendations into short-term and long-term. I'm not necessarily recommending all of them. It was just more of a list of things that you could do. I did put a disclaimer in my staff report that none of these options could do anything. Like I said, the housing market is based off of things that we can and can't control. And so these are the things we can control, or at least work on, but they're not guaranteed to succeed in any way, shape, or form. So you can accept them as a whole or accept a selection of them based on your comfort. So the first one is the most upfront, is recommending an extension of the connection reduction program to November 2021. This was requested by a number of interviewees saying that they needed additional time to get plans together to apply for that program. We have had a lot of interest in that program from my office, and it does take more than a year to plan a residential development. One of the things we did hear from the builder is that he's considering building 2 duplexes in the city of Mount Shasta, and that's going to take him about 3 years of planning to do before he's ready to get the connections and things like that. From someone who builds either investment properties or is a home developer for home ownership, for selling those off, you need additional time to get that capital. As stated before, loans have changed and they do require a higher investment from those developers, and so it takes a little bit to get that initial capital as well as sort out the financing and budget for those projects. So extending it another 2 years, I think, could show an increase in residential units in the city. The second one is hold a building and development forum to collect more input from the building community and build relationships with the building sector. As stated previously, we don't have a good relationship, and that's a problem. We need to work directly with those builders to address city needs, not just residentially, but commercially. So there's some additional benefits to holding a builder forum. The idea is to reverse the reputation of the city, to open a line of communication. Some of the things I'll mention later for recommendations could be brought to the builder forum for initial input prior to city council approval, just so that we're not putting additional regulations on those builders. The third short-term recommendation is approach Siskiyou County, City of Weed, and City of Dunsmuir to discuss housing as a regional issue. So when doing an assessment of housing best practices, I saw that the most aggressive and the most successful entities are regional ones. So metropolitan areas, cities that work together to coordinate all of that. So we would have a better opportunity for pooling our regional financial resources, but we also have the ability to look at housing as a regional thing. So what was brought up was the city of Mount Shasta is more for retirees' second vacation homes, and that's okay. Something we need to realize is as a city, we don't have to necessarily meet every single demographic's needs. Like I said, housing is a regional issue, and it's well known that City of Weed has more low-income options. City of Dunsmuir has more family-based options, and that's okay. We work together on those things, and the people who live in those subsequent areas frequent here as well. It was one of the discussion items that came up with the builder who wanted permits for the surrounding area in the city. Those people frequent the city, or those people work in the city, and they don't necessarily have to be in the city limits to benefit the city. And I think looking at it as a regional issue may help us in the future grow into the city that we want it to be. And that'll come up with one of the recommendations as well. The fourth is to continue efforts to clarify and streamline development processes. This is something the city's been working on for a while. Consolidating and streamlining the development process for commercial and residential buildings will not only assist us with communication, so we have a pre-application meeting that we're stressing now where everybody's at the table so that there's no hidden fees, there's no hidden applications, everybody knows what the standards are up front. And we're hoping to, if we go forward with the building forum, present that process to the builders directly and hopefully clear up some of the delays and unknown costs that they've experienced in the past. The fifth is the development and implementation of a short-term rental market outreach strategy. As I discussed before, Planning Commission recommended this one to be added because we want to look at the motivations of why people choose short-term rentals over long-term rentals. We want to know if they understand that there is a shortage of long-term rentals in the city and if they would switch over from short-term to long-term. And then what actions, if any, should be taken to equal out the economic development and housing market situation. So we're kind of just looking for more information and investigation with that. So as far as the two major long-term, one of which is investigate and approach vacant property owners and develop a subdivision which includes low-income, very low-income, and extremely low-income housing options. So this is based off of what we call inclusionary zoning, where we include different types of income levels into developments. Traditionally, we see it with 5 or more housing units, so major apartment complexes. I don't think that would work here for 2 reasons. most of the people that were interviewed that discussed, 5 or more units thought that that wasn't an appropriate thing for the city of Mount Shasta. The city of Mount Shasta wants to, in their opinion, emulate a small town, and reducing the number of large apartment complexes is part of that. A lot of people said that duplexes and triplexes are perfectly fine for the area. It fits into the character of the town. That being said, the second reason why I don't think 5 or more unit inclusionary zoning will work is because I don't think we have the scale to cover the costs. So similar to what was brought up in the past, is having any affordable units is just not going to make sense economically for investors. You would have to have either a large grant or a large, subsidized loan in that process, and that hasn't worked for us seeking that out in the past. But if we approach people on a subdivision scale, you're now looking at 45 possible lots. And if we were to put 5 of them into the low income, extremely low income category, we can offset the cost of those lots onto the other 40, which is a much more scalable solution. And I think it could work a little bit more properly than a 5+ unit solution. So I think this is one that it will take an estimated 1 to 2 years. It takes quite a bit to get through a subdivision application that goes through Planning Commission. I can't remember if it ends up in City Council at all, but Planning Commission usually oversees the subdivision regulations, which goes into street construction, parks, allocations, things like that. But I think if you are looking to do more low-income housing options, this subdivision option is probably your best bet. Like I said, it would have to take some maneuvering, but in this case too, working with a subdivision, you could bring in a private developer to do the subdivision, and the city would have the opportunity to do financing mechanisms. So the city cannot be a housing developer. Some cities have had success with it in the past, but we have some issues up here with scaling and, like I said, cost of the project. If the city were to become the developer, we have to do prevailing wage. We have to follow government regulations as if it were a public works project, which brings in, like I said, it doesn't bring the cost down just because we're the developer. But if we were to sell our land at a low rate, things like that, we can maybe do that. But the financing measure is probably your better bet for that one. And long term takes that. The final one is, I brought it up before, but the city's character. So the city's already in a general plan revision, which will adjust some of the current city regulations that may lead to issues that we've foreseen. And the biggest one is short-term rental policy. So during the general planning session, the first section is determining the new vision for the city. So what is the vision of the city in 2045? The current city vision for the 2007 doesn't give a very good description of what you want to be as far as your housing options. We want to be a small town, but we want to have industry and a lot of workers, and so it's all over the board, and it's very difficult to interpret something that is that broad. I think the general plan process, you'll see a revision to that community character that may get us a little bit closer to how we want to deal with short-term rentals, wetlands and natural features, development densities, and inclusionary zoning and land use policies. So I think having no action until we receive more information from the general plan related to those things is important and pertinent.
Thank you. Questions for Juliana?
You want to go? Okay. I want to clarify a short-term rental because when I was on Planning Commission about 3 years ago or so, it was a long time ago, yeah. Paul Eckert, the city manager at the time, sent out this cease and desist letters to people that were renting a room out of their house, right? And it was described as short-term rentals were illegal in R1. So I want to get really clear on the definition of short-term rental because it seems like there's been some confusion about that. What I understand short-term rental is an empty house that's rented in its entirety to a visitor for less than 1 month, right? Do you remember when it came before council and you guys decided to say, we don't want to make short-term rentals illegal in R1? Mm-hmm. Now, an example one of the citizens came forward and said, I want to advertise a room in my house to rent on Airbnb so I can continue to afford my mortgage, and that was disallowed, you know. So I just want to be clear when you're talking about short-term rentals that it's different if you have an owner-occupied house versus an empty house. And that short-term rental is exclusive only for an empty house. And I just wanted, is that correct?
The proposal at the time, as I recall when we voted on it, was to have only owner or caretaker occupied houses. That an entire house could not be rented out without a full-time occupant living in the house. That was the definition that we had, and we denied it for R1, even with that caveat.
Right. I don't think that's legally a short-term rental. I think that renting a room in your house, according to the conversation I had, is actually a legal activity in any of the zones.
So for your information, Section 18.08.765, short-term rental means a transient occupancy as defined by 18.08.795 and includes but is not necessarily limited to a hotel as defined by MSC 18 whatever, as well as any rental of a living unit or portion of a living unit for a term shorter than a month, 2-month tenancy. Sorry. So yeah, so if you are renting out a portion of your living unit on a month-to-month basis, that would be a short-term rental by your definition that you approved. So.
Okay.
Normally, if they have someone on site, it's considered a bed and breakfast, which is a different ordinance and a different procedure. Normally.
Yeah, I don't think we clarified that. I believe the recommendation was that we consider only short-term rentals that were owner-occupied in R1, owner or caretaker occupied in R1, and we turned that down. So it must not have been anything in the definition at that time that prohibited that consideration. Okay, other questions of Juliana?
Juliana, thank you for your good report. I am interested in knowing number of interviewees and number per category. Perhaps you could just provide those of us who asked for the background information for your report.
Yeah, and I have all the raw data in an Excel spreadsheet if you would really like to peruse that. I did not associate names with the people who are on that Excel spreadsheet, but we had 9 people that we interviewed overall. We had one developer, who was solely building and development. I should say there were a few people who transcend a lot of these different categories. So we had a lot of people who were real estate property management and developers. So we did interview some people who had duplexes, triplexes in the city limits. 2 of the 9 had 5 or more units, but they weren't in the city of Mount Shasta. One was in Dunsmuir, and I think the other was in Weed. Then we had only one financer, and most of them were in the real estate property management section.
Also, related to this issue, last week I received an email from Terry Barber, County CAO. I think Cotter may have contacted you in the last couple of days. The county adopted a resolution for vacation rentals in the Mount Shasta sphere of influence back in 2003, but never implemented their resolution. She was, her email to me last week, which I intend to share with council and staff, asks what is the City of Mount Shasta's current position on the issues that were brought up in the 2003 resolution. I frankly don't recall the matter ever coming to City Council in 2003. So it'd be interesting to see what the city's position is now.
So I have background on that, and so I believe there was a resolution passed by the city council in 2007 clarifying their position. And it's not necessarily about short-term rentals. What the resolution, it was a joint resolution, and it basically confirmed that the city of Mount Shasta does not support short-term rentals on residential lots 2.5 acres or less. Yeah, so it was really specific, but what I'm going to be doing for the county, they requested that we take a look at our meeting minutes of the discussion of that city council, but what I can do after that's collected, and I think the plan with the city manager was to collect that and then send it to you all about, here's the background of what it was and why the decision was made.
Great. I thought we might put that on a February agenda if it works out with staff and council.
Yeah, the county had requested input by February 6th, so I don't think we're going to be able to get you anything solid by then. I think what we had planned on doing is not necessarily saying what the city's current position is, but just clarifying what the thoughts of that previous one were.
The CAO didn't give a deadline, so
Okay.
when I spoke with her, I think I indicated that we'd probably take it up in February.
Mm-hmm.
And it is what? What our current position on short-term rentals is?
Right, she was asking what would be the city's position on vacation rentals that are located in the county but in the city's sphere of influence.
So here's another term, vacation rental. What does that mean? Because we only have short-term and long-term, right?
So
What is
actually you do.
vacation rental.
So
What is
actually
that
you do
different?
that correctly. So in my review of short-term rentals is a lot of cities are getting sued on the term vacation rental because vacation means a lot of different things. I would not advise changing the city's term because what they're recommending people go to is a time-based element, which is the short or long-term. So the way we have our terms defined right now is actually the best practice right now.
And what I was going to suggest is that I think one of the other council members, I don't know if it was Councilmember Stackfluff or Councilmember Wagner, but somebody, if I recall correctly, suggested that we keep the housing issue on agenda to move things forward. While we were at this council meeting, I did sign up this evening, since it's January 22nd, I did sign up for the February 8th.
You think you got it in time since it's before midnight?
It indicated $149. I gave my credit card information, so maybe as long as we get reservations in by midnight tonight. So maybe we can put it on either the first or second, put housing issues to continue the conversation on for the first or second meeting in February to continue with our efforts.
So how does that correspond with the recommendations in the report here?
Well,
And what would be the specific?
we don't have, it's not an action item for tonight.
It is an action item for
No,
tonight.
it's not. There's
What
nothing
does
about
it
proposed
says-
action. There's nothing about action being taken tonight. So if the intent was to...
Choose from, for the city council to choose from addressing the constraints. Actually, there's a typo in there.
It was,
The options are ranked from highest priority lowest. So I read that as direction that we choose from what was presented.
I saw it as a discussion item, not an action item.
Okay, what was the intent?
My understanding is that I was to present the constraints and a list of recommendations for the city council to act upon. Whether you act upon them or not is your purview.
Well, you gave us a long list of about a half a dozen or so options. And now, are you willing to go forward with all of them? Are you asking for a priority list, 1, 2, 3, 4, or?
My understanding was you guys, from the ad hoc too, my understanding is you wanted a series of options that could possibly address the constraints that we identified, so you may choose any, all, or none.
Okay, well, I'm definitely in favor can we go ahead and start saying we're in
Yes.
favor?
Is there any?
I'm definitely in
These are
favor
questions
of,
still, and then we need to do public comment.
okay, sorry.
I think in terms
Stop.
of discussion, we can have discussion, but there may be a problem with taking any action on the matter tonight because I don't know that the public, that it was noticed in a way that the public would know that we were actually taking action on this item tonight. So I think that's another reason I suggest that it be on the February agenda.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. If there is indeed some confusion about it, we'd need to look at what else is on the first February agenda, and decide whether it should go there or the next one.
It says to choose.
Yeah, it does. It says to choose. Are there any rest of you who want to weigh in on this? I'd like to hear your opinion. John,
Well,
Paul?
obviously, if there's a financial decision associated with it, for example, continuing
Well,
the-
clearly, continuing the fee reduction would be something we could decide on tonight.
continuing the fee reduction was something I
Yeah.
thought we might want to wait on because it's more of a monetary decision versus a relationship decision, so.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, the fees are there for a reason, obviously.
We have had a Brown Act violation complaint once in the recent past. I don't want to see that happen again, and we can avoid that by putting it on the February 8th agenda for action, discussion and action.
Paul, do you have any?
I certainly understand what Tim is saying. Yeah, I don't want to go through that again either. But, to prioritize things maybe is okay. So,
Yeah, we can have discussion tonight.
Right.
I don't know that we can take any, I would just recommend that we not actually take any action tonight because of the way it was worded. And if we're not going to take any action with it, it may make sense to just table the item until the February 12th meeting and then take it up all at once.
I don't have any problem with the language. I think that, I think the violation of Brown Act was called by the city was extremely controversial subject. This is a housing affordability initiative that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. We have high rent rates in the city, and we have affordable housing issues. So why table it when we have an opportunity to at least have a conversation and set some priorities?
How about as a compromise that we ask that Juliana come back to us with a feeling for a work plan associated with each of these items, assuming that priorities end up where they are? Would you see, how would you see proceeding with that? In the next month, you'd see, holding a development forum, that kind of thing, some feel for how it would occur and by when. A little, because or perhaps we could identify tonight anything that we needed further information on in order to make a decision clearly next time. Is there anything that isn't clear enough in weighing these priorities that you would ask for more information on if we're going to bring it up again?
I know it just sounds like you're just asking the staff to go back and do more work because we're not ready.
Yeah, agreed.
So,
Because on the surface of it, I would recommend all these things
so
move forward on all that.
just for information, so for example,
I don't have a problem with any.
you're not committing the city to do anything tonight. You're just saying these are the options you would kind of like us to start to look at. For example, Number one, recommend an extension of the connection reduction program. We would need a resolution and to do a
Right.
public hearing to extend that anyway.
Right.
So you're allowing additional time for the public to come in and say, that's really off base, you shouldn't do that. So as far as, the Brown Act violation, you're not committing the city to really anything tonight. You're just saying, these are the options that we like. Can you bring us more information forward?
So then what would the council do with your recommendations right now? Would we just move to give you permission to continue doing what you were doing and move towards resolutions?
Yep, pretty much.
Yeah, well, I have no problem with that.
I mean, you can pick what, you can say, for example, we don't agree with working with Siskiyou County or the city of Weed to do this, and so we don't want to do that. You have every right to do that. I'm just saying these were your options to address these constraints, and so you can say, I don't like some of these. I mean, really the only feedback I got is we like all of these. So
Certainly, that's what Paul and I gave you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, excuse me. I like all of these. I certainly think there should be public discussion about some of these items, especially the short-term rentals. That's a topic that is, I mean, that's a hot topic, really a hot topic, and we should have community input and more education on that. Recommend the extensions. I think that's kind of something that does take a resolution to accept, correct? That'd have to be on the agenda. A forum is something that we could agree to do and see how that turns out. I mean, that's a good idea. Do I think we're going to get a lot of builders? No, I don't. I think that's been a battle. I think it's a process that's going to have to, yeah, buy them a beer, whatever.
A wine and cheese forum.
Yeah. Approach the county, city of Dunsmuir. I mean, they do have some subdivisions that are ripe for lower cost housing. And there are some builders I've been talking to who can build for a pretty reasonable fee, is what they're saying. So, I mean, there's a lot of different things we can get going here. I mean, they're not going to build for $250 a square foot, and they have reasonably priced lots with connection fees paid for, and they can build a 1,200 square foot house for $250,000 out the door. So, I mean, there are things out there.
Well, no, I've heard, it's more than anecdotal, that there's some builders out of Reading that came up here and built a house for one of our county employees, and it was surprisingly affordable.
Yeah,
Under
yeah.
$200 a square foot. Now, it was on county land, not in the city.
Yeah.
But apparently there's possibilities for housing expansion.
Yeah.
So I'd like to entertain a motion
Yeah.
to, unless there are any serious reservations about any of these, how about we hear a motion to move ahead with
I don't
these?
have a serious reservation about any of them, but I want some clarification around the 45 lots that she talked about.
And I'd like to discuss it further, because I haven't really, if we're just here for discussion, I'd like to put in my thoughts on it. Can I have that opportunity?
Right now, sure.
Okay, thank you. In terms of, I like the idea of the holding a building and development forum. I'd certainly be willing to consider a possible extension, depending on circumstances. Because we have a large number of single persons living in Mount Shasta, I think some of those could consider studio space instead of a 2 or 3 bedroom space. We have talked about tiny houses. There's also the possibility, because the city owns a whole lot of land at the south end of town, if a portion of that property could be used for housing, the city could perhaps, if the city were willing, to make that property attractive financially for builders, a portion of that. We, in the past, maybe not with this city council, but others, we've talked about the possibility of using one or more acres of Roseburg property, perhaps for a residential land trust that would be a nonprofit corporation that would create housing or allow others to create housing on that property and lease the space, lease the land. The idea being creating permanently affordable housing that would be income qualified to get into the project, and when there was resale, sell below market value based upon a formula for increase. So that's another possibility that we could discuss. In terms of the looking at it as a regional issue for Siskiyou County, Weed, Dunsmuir, Mount Shasta, and having affordable housing elsewhere but not in Mount Shasta, I would tend not to be in favor of that approach, since we as a city council previously took a position that if somebody works in the city of Mount Shasta, they should be able to afford to live in the city of Mount Shasta. I think the consensus of council was not to become a Steamboat Springs or some other place, or San Francisco, where people who make a lot of money can live in Mount Shasta, but the service folks have to live elsewhere and commute. So I'd like to see us follow through with the position that we took previously of finding ways that persons of all income levels, including service jobs, folks can afford to live inside city limits.
Does
idea
number
of-
6 not take care of that for you, Tim? I'm just trying to get some clarification. Investigate and approach vacant property owners, develop a subdivision which includes that range.
Well, it might in part, and at the same time, I'd like to approach the city of Mount Shasta, that is a large property owner inside city limits, to consider what we as a city can do. Because I think we are the elephant in the room. I think we have a great opportunity to promote housing at all income levels through and on property that the city owns.
What about if we added vacant property owners and city-owned land?
I think that would be appropriate.
I would recommend a separate item, number 8, to address
Separate
that,
item.
because there's some additional issues that come with city property as a vacant landowner that I mentioned before about, we do add to the cost of a build. If we're doing city property, you have to look into different financing, as well as, we do have to charge livable wage. But as far as Roseburg, we would have to consider some additional zoning mechanisms in addition to the subdivision. So I would keep any city property recommendations separate from the vacant property owners, because there's a little bit more of an advantage working with a private property owner and just maybe doing a financing district or a financing option for them.
Well, then I think that the idea of adding a number 8 is laudable.
And I think our general plan revision can really address a lot of issues too. We can go this way or go that way with it. So I think that's an item that has a lot of flexibility that we can start discussing down the road. I think that's where a lot of the solutions are going to come.
Just for clarification, if the city is involved with the housing project, even if it's just with respect to financing, setting up a CREO district, is it automatically going to be considered a public works project?
No. So the reason why I came up is there was a court case that happened in the last year where a city donated. Basically, they allowed people to build a housing development on their land, and someone sued because they weren't paying prevailing wage.
Right.
If we're a partner in that sense, it's considered a real money contribution or a real city contribution. So we have to look at it as, it would be something we'd have to work with the city attorney on to make sure that we kind of stayed away from the prevailing wage section.
Right.
And that's why I kind of separated it out, because there's maybe some nuances there. But as far as applying financing districts, some cities have had a really good success doing that for larger projects, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a city public works project. It's just you're financing an area of the city like you would an infrastructure district, or one of the new things they're trying to pass is called a workforce housing zone district, which has some financing mechanisms in there. That wouldn't necessarily make us have to do the prevailing wage and have all the extra, fixings that public projects have to have. So it takes some looking at and some figuring out, but there are some ways to get around it.
Okay.
Okay, well, recent talk with a young person who used to live here, moved away, moved back, said that the rent prices are just off the charts, way too high in Mount Shasta. So the young professionals coming back can't afford to live here, and that's the market right now. I'm interested right now in the idea of that 45 lots, where 40 would be compensating for the lower 5 lots, say the lower priced 5 lots. I'm wondering, how do you keep those prices low going forward? Obviously, the 40 are going to be in the competitive market, but how do we keep those 5 lots affordable?
So you can do that through a number of different mechanisms. So one is if we were to do kind of a financing district to help with the initial cost of the investment for infrastructure for those lots, you can write into the agreement that they have to be for a certain amount of time. Similar to how, if you take a look at how Section 8 is handed out, Section 8 is no longer available, but the way they set up their planning and legal documentation has some structure to how you could do that through that mechanism. We could do, cities can do a rent management program. It's usually either done through an ordinance or city policy that would take a little bit more investigating on what that would look like. There's a number of incentives that you can do. You can either do the negative incentive of saying it has to be in perpetuity for some reason. There is the CC&Rs that are a possibility as well. So there's a number of different ways we could do that. It would really depend on the private property holder. It would depend on the development. And I only used 45 lots as an example. We do have some vacant properties that are close to infrastructure, would have a low amount of environmental review that could easily fit about 30 to 40, we think, depending upon park allocations and things like that. So, I think it's doable. I think that's going to be your best bet for scaling those things. But as far as the legal mechanisms, we would write that into the agreements as far as how that would look.
And then I'm wondering, I heard your comment about singles, and I don't know, and I would have to ask more often when I see young people. I'm not a young person anymore. But I don't know if they want to live alone or with other people. I mean, would they rather share a 3-bedroom house and split? Do they really want the social element of being single, or do they really want to have their own small unit, a studio? I don't know what the trend is.
So having a good mix of housing opportunities.
Yeah.
We have everything from the light blue inn, which are studios, to 3-bedroom houses that are shared space. One of the things I would hope that we can do also is it could be that the February 8 housing conference might bring up some additional ideas that we would like to consider as well.
I think we already made an advancement with the ADUs, adding ADUs. I think our overall goal is is to do infill, to have our population concentrated in the downtown area as close to services as possible, to revive the downtown, to get people located in mixed uses as close to downtown as possible. I mean, even Danco, who came with their development option for the land across from the Masonic Lodge, said, you know, this is an ideal location for your affordable housing because you're walking distance to downtown, you have a great view of the mountain, you do a little community center. I mean, I just thought it was ideal, you know.
And I like the idea of inclusionary housing rather than the Euclidean model. So where you can have single-family residential and multifamily
Mixed in.
Mixed
And
in,
I think that
yeah.
helps. It helps
Yeah.
the overall community feel if you, the diversity, adding various types of living conditions. Yeah.
I like the idea of adding the vacant, or the city property as an evaluation topic. We may end up deciding that the best option is for private land development of subdivisions, but why eliminate it from the outset? I appreciate that suggestion. After talking to the number of realtors that we did and people involved in property management, I'm not as confident that we're going to be able to easily have people who work here live here. And I wish there were a way, because there are so many people who have more income who are gobbling up those properties. And it'll probably continue more and more so as the trends continue from the urban areas. So I wish there were a way, and maybe there is a way, to survey potential renters and home purchasers to see if the distance between Weed and Lake Shastina and Dunsmuir and Mount Shasta is an impediment. I mean, to me, if I couldn't afford to live here, if I couldn't find anything and I couldn't afford it, then to drive 8 miles or so wouldn't be a huge thing. So I think the regional, at least the discussions around the regional approach makes sense to me, just because of the discouragement I got based on all of the folks we talked about who were talking about the various factors and the availability in the adjacent towns.
Well, I don't want to give up on that idea that we adopted
It's a
previously.
great thought.
Principle. And whenever I used the word can't as a kid, my grandmother would say, spell your can't without a T and you will do it successfully.
But you concluded, this study concluded that in a purely market environment, purely open market environment, this town is not affordable for most people that work in the area.
Right.
And that you would have to have some sort of governmental intervention to help. The question is, can we do that? So, yeah.
Can we, or do we want to?
Yeah.
Do we choose to?
There may be some zoning regulations or, modifications that might open that up a little bit, allowing smaller lots. And, the state now allows for additional units on your property, which may take off in this area too. And that's something we may want to pursue with forums and stuff to let people know that that's existing. I mean, a lot of people don't even know that's happening now. So, I mean, there's some other little ideas there, but I think it's market driven right now, and it's very, very difficult every day it gets more difficult. But then you never know what's going to happen with the economy. It could just totally fall and become affordable again. So we just never know. But presently, it's market driven, and it's lower priced homes are just going skyrocket.
So I'd like to return to the Planning Commission recommendations. We just addressed the first one, which was to assess city properties. There was no formal recommendations, I understand, but I was there and I heard the discussion and I thought it was interesting. The second one was to develop and promote a flexible minimum home square footage program, which also speaks to one of the things you had addressed, Tim. And the third was an infrastructure assessment. I believe we've already agreed to try and find $1 million grant to help us do that overall infrastructure assessment because of the degree. And in this case, it does affect housing availability. The second one about promoting a flexible minimum home square footage program. How did you plan to incorporate that discussion into what you're recommending, Juliana, or were you just not going to adopt that one?
For the planning, I just wanted to bring up what the planning commission discussed so that you kind of knew what they covered. If you remember, there was a motion to do the flexible minimum square footage, but it wasn't seconded. It wasn't really continued by them as a formal recommendation. That's something I've had to deal with recently, actually. And I have actually been a little bit more flexible with our minimum square footages because theoretically, if you have a subpar lot, which could be one, so we normally set minimum square footages in our zoning code. And if you have a subpar lot, you technically can't build on it, which is silly. So I've been a little bit more flexible with people who are still meeting the setbacks, still meeting fire codes, still able to provide on-site parking requirements. They can meet every other regulation that we have. They just happen to be building a home that's 800 square feet rather than the minimum 1,000 for that lot. I've been working with them to do that because, you have to be flexible in those circumstances, and the way that I look at them is it wouldn't change the character of the neighborhood that they're set in. I look at them as far as, do they cause any adverse effects to the surrounding area? So for example, would it really create a dense, more urban type neighborhood rather than a, small town community, whatever that looks like? For you guys, but I actually have already been pretty flexible with people, and I think the general plan will formalize a little bit more of a flexible zoning code to address that. So I don't think you really need to make it a formal recommendation at this point. We don't have a lot of proposals for those subpar units. I think right now I'm only working with one person who has one, and it's only 200 square feet less than what the minimum is supposed to be. So it's really not a huge impediment.
So we have a minimum 1,000 square foot on a certain size lot?
For certain zones, yeah.
For certain zones.
Yeah.
Which I think, as you were saying, could be modified. And as Paul was saying, we could work with the zoning requirements.
Yeah.
So trying to round this discussion up, what's your feeling, council members, about approving the recommendations as they stand with number 8 added about assessing city property for opportunities, and then bringing up other opportunities that you may have thought about during a follow-up discussion, say 3 months down the line, I don't know, something that would be reasonable given staff's other priorities about telling us, where you've gotten with these things, what your impediments are, what your plans are, that sort of thing, kind of along the lines of what Tim was talking about. How do you plan to, are we okay with approving these as they are with number 8 added, and then asking that staff get back to us and plan something, because it is a critical issue in this town.
And we did have some
Several months down the line.
We had some qualifying language for the short-term rental outreach as well, but she heard that. So
Yeah,
that's good.
yeah.
But I mean,
well said,
is the housing ad hoc committee still alive and well, or is it dissolved? Has it met its goals, or what's the status of that?
That's a good question. We met the goals as initially defined to describe the issues and problems, not the solutions. That was our initial charge, was to identify constraints to the housing market.
All right, so I'll move that the council approve the recommendations plus number 8 and task staff with coming up with solutions to the housing problems of Mount Shasta.
Based on following up on the things that are in here.
Correct.
And any, okay. Is there a second? I'll second it. All those in favor?
And just in terms
Or
of discussion.
Yes.
In terms of.
Thank you. Discussion?
And I don't know that we've had this, have we had?
Oh, public comment.
on
We
this?
did not? I forgot, again?
So let's.
Is there any public comment that either of you would like to make? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of, I would be generally supportive of the recommendations for further investigation and work. I don't know that I want to be bound by the deadlines and say that I'm approving a 3 to 4 year do-nothing action. I'm looking at number 7 here, because it says recommend no action until the final general plan is approved. And I'm not supportive of kicking the can down the road for 3 or 4 years and not taking any action until then.
You know, that's a good point, I think, Tim. What I look forward to is understanding better the connections between the different elements in the plan. Infrastructure, the connectivity, the what do you call it, circulation one, the economic development one. I don't understand enough about how this general plan is going to come together but conceptually I can see that these other elements affect, there's an integration that needs to happen, and so I don't want to rule on something prematurely without having considered the other factors.
So I would like us to be able, I'd like us to do what we can do now. And it may be this step and that step, maybe baby steps, I don't know. But I do think that there are things that we can do now and in the near future to move forward towards some housing solutions, rather than simply saying, do nothing for 3 or 4 years. Because as I read number 7, that is what I read into number 7 was, do nothing for 3 or 4 years.
So just for your information, it's not do nothing for 3 to 4 years. It's just saying when it comes to an overall policy related to like building density, development density, zoning, defining. So one of the things we talked about is defining community character happens earlier in the general plan process. So you can easily act upon that once that's done. But the zoning code, you actually have to wait until the general plan is done before you can really address a lot of that. So it's not all of the things we wait for. It's just some of the things we put in here.
So number 7 is about the detailed regulations regarding housing, which you're saying can only be finalized until when the general plan is concluded.
You can use your current one.
And we can work with the current plan to come up with other solutions.
The current plan is kind of part of the problem, so we have to change that. But like the short-term rental policy and defining community character, that happens fairly early in the process. You can act upon that earlier in the process. But overall, the general plan is going to take care of a lot of the development issues, but it does take some time to do. Making premature decisions on development density, building density, and the zoning portions is not advisable, but there are some that you can.
And I do think that when we shared our goals with Bruce, the city manager goals, we did reiterate the need to move forward with up to the 30 connections, new house connections at the reduced rate, which is what we had initially planned when it was passed in 2016. And we also said provide for 5 low to moderate income housing units with by 2019 if possible,
and
right?
we also gave him a goal of increasing the population inside city limits by 300 people in the next 2 years. So we can't give him an impossible task of doing that if we don't address the housing issues now.
Yeah, and you got to be careful what you ask for, because you should probably qualify the kinds of people that you want for those 300, because you know the comment that you got at the Lola meeting.
We weren't talking about increase of 300 homeless or transients.
But you didn't qualify it, so you gotta be careful what you ask for.
Okay, so there's a motion and there's a second on the table. Any more discussion?
So in general, I support this with the understanding that these are relatively flexible. Is that correct? Okay.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, unanimous decision. Thank you very much. Okay, moving,
And I think some of those are inconsistent with some of the others, but it's something, it gives us a framework that we can work through.
okay.
That's my
So-
understanding.
Moving on now to council reports on attendance at appointed and outside meetings.
I'll go first.
John?
We had a DEAC meeting that was rescheduled to this coming Wednesday.
I'm sure they can't hear you.
The DEAC meeting that was scheduled for last week was rescheduled to this Wednesday, so I have nothing to report on.
8:30?
Paul?
No, I have none.
Nothing? Barbara?
Yeah, I attended the Lola meeting, which was lots of fun. It was a huge attendance. We had Lisa Nixon, John Lopi, we had Tule Lake, who I'd never experienced at a Lola meeting before, so it was like, that was cool.
So Lola is a League of Local Agent area.
Siskiyou
Cities.
County
Used to
League of
be
Local
local
Agencies.
cities, but it's, yeah.
Yeah. Tim accepted the nomination to be the dinner host for the next year. And yeah, it was nice. We had a chance for the cities to talk to each other. You're a good host. I really appreciated you. You seemed like you were enjoying yourself up there in the front room. So I also attended the Women's March, which is not necessarily an outside meeting, but I want to thank you, Kathy, for doing a phenomenal out of the ballpark speech. I mean, I felt you really connected with your audience really well. You knew your audience. Your speech was easy to listen to. At one point, she had these pregnant pauses, and you could hear a pin drop. The audience was so in anticipation of what she wanted to say next. It was amazing that you were able to hold your audience so well. Really enjoyed that. Hanging out, I hung out with a young guy who had an anarchist flag. So, yeah, that's it.
A lot of diversity there. I have several meetings.
Do you want me to go first, or
I
or do
can.
you want to go before me?
You can go.
Doesn't matter.
I'm ready.
Okay.
At the beautification meeting, just a reminder that there are 2 open seats, vacancies on that committee. We talked about hanging baskets, that they have a prototype that will, hopefully we buy fewer of them and they would hold water longer and they're larger. But Public Works is testing them with Juliana now to make sure that they're not too big for the banner poles and not too heavy. So that testing is going on now. They need to be planted by mid-March, so because we'll be doing them in town here, so we need to keep moving forward on that. We talked about murals. The Planning Commission is looking at doing a separate, to separate out murals from a sign ordinance. That they're working on a mural ordinance now. The process for submissions and to clarify how we protect artists as well as property owners. They're working on that ordinance now, hopefully making it least cumbersome. And Beautification Committee is interested in being part of the approval committee for those murals. As far as the banners go, we had ordered some snowflakes, which were sold out, so we'll be ordering them in time, hopefully for next winter. They may have been the only snowflakes in town until today. Also, we had ordered banners, which were locally designed. Final design is in. It was clarified that those banners would be owned by the city and that the city can't sell the products to others unless we have another entity take it on. There's been some interest among many people because they like the design so much, they would like to be able to sell those. So it's possible that the city could release the rights, having the chamber sell it, something like that, to make some income out of their visitors bureau there. And we discussed creating a pole versus across the street banner policy. There's been some we could do banners across the street for events like the Mountain Runners, and the Mountain Runners have some hardware for that. Or there's the poles along the street that we hang the flowers from that would also serve to hold banners. So they're looking, the beautification will work on a draft policy on that. Let me see here. I also attended a Pacific Crest Trail Association, the Trail Town Advisory Committee that has formed of citizens. And we had a good meeting on the 10th where we definitely divided into 5 committees, subcommittees, sub-teams, and we elected heads of those. Those committees are the Events Committee, which will plan an event to occur on the weekend of the 20th, 21st, and 22nd of July to coincide with the board, the PCTA board that will be here, and the League of California Cities. So there's an event committee of which I'm the convener. There's a communications and outreach committee, which will handle both website and local outreach. Kathy Wilson, representing the city, and I are on that one. There's a visitor services and business committee hoping to outreach to the visitors to look at providing discounts. Perhaps the PCTA could even provide a passport for PCT hikers that would enable them to have reduced services. Again, this is all in the very preliminary stages. There's an infrastructure maintenance and improvement project team and a volunteer engagement and education team on which Paul sits with his connections with the high school potential volunteers. And we've all agreed to meet before February 5th, the sub-teams probably by conference call. And we also agreed that there would be a sort of a coordinating council made up of individuals sitting on each of those committees. And that each of us we would identify our major goals and our funds and any funds needed so that that can be evaluated. I attended a Siskiyou Homelessness Coalition meeting, also the second week in January, where we spent a lot of time outlining specifics of each community's plans to do the point-in-time count of homeless. Lots of training has occurred between now and then. The point-in-time starts tomorrow, and the question being that we ask of homeless, where were you on the night tonight? And so we have several teams set up in Mount Shasta. I believe it's 7 teams who will be lined out tomorrow morning at the city park about which areas they will cover. And it's been a tremendous amount of work in organizing this. Hopefully we'll be gathering some data from them about what their needs are and perhaps be able to follow up with them as we set up these multidisciplinary teams to evaluate case by case what can be done. Let's see, I have. Huh? How's my leg? My leg is improving. I'm just about healed. Thank you for asking. I'm sorry, I met with Kamala Harris's field representative, as did, I believe, most of us. I think John wasn't able to. I had a good conversation with her about the issues, challenges, as well as the great things that rural communities are doing, such as ours, the successes. It was great to meet her. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of Sydney Smith, Kamala Harris's field rep, Sydney Lewis, thank you. I've got her card here. She is the person in Kamala Harris's office who writes letters in support of grant applications. So she indicated that we should go through her to get support for.
And if I remember correctly, I'm glad you brought that up. It's for CDBG. She goes through all the CDBG grant applications and some infrastructure road things, the name of which I've forgotten, starts with a T. I have it in my notes, but I don't have it, yeah.
So it was I met her at the Women's March. and a good connection that we need to build on. Last Wednesday, I was in Oroville, California, attending a broadband funding conference. And I took a bunch of notes on that, which I haven't converted into type format yet, but I'll send those out to the rest of the council members. Also attending that meeting was Melinda Matson of Economic Development Administration. We had a nice chat, and she says EDA is ready to provide some funding to the city of Mount Shasta for infrastructure projects where there are increase in jobs, e.g. the Roseburg property, the landing. Because we intend to create a bunch of employment at the Roseburg property. We can't do that until we get infrastructure in place. And so my understanding from Melinda was that that would be a good project, the sewer and water for the landing would be a good project to go through her office on.
Great contact.
So, also met, the second day down in Oroville was the 2018 North State Economic Forecast Conference. It happens every year. Excellent. I sent council members, or maybe I sent it to staff for distribution to council members. Looks like that's what I did. The Professor or Dr. Eiler's 11th annual economic forecast for the North State. I did not editorialize on that. If you see some things that says that we're moving along just fine and will continue that regardless of what the Trump administration does, that was his analysis, not mine. In terms of housing, he doesn't see any big changes in housing. There will be continued increase in price. The interest rates are going to pretty much stay about the same. He expects the gross national product to be in the 2.5% to 3% increase year over year, again, regardless of what the Trump administration does. There may be some softening in the market, but no great sell-offs. He's not expecting any big recession. I probably don't want to take the time to repeat everything that's in his report, but if that hasn't come to you yet, it will be coming to you. I also heard from the assistant city manager of Chico, giving a report. Those PowerPoint slides are going to be disseminated to you as well. Yes?
On what?
Huh? Chris Constantine's slides.
You sent those to me.
Oh, okay. I sent those to the city manager, so hopefully they'll get sent out to the council members as well. There was another presentation on at the Economic Summit. There was another presentation on PERS and PERS liability. Excellent and scary presentation. And also got those PowerPoint slides to be distributed to the other council members and city staff. I met Jason Schwenkler of California State University Chico Geographical Information Center. The Geographical Information Center has taken over from CED. as the, I guess the, as CED, I guess the economic division there at Chico State. So they are the ones that can provide internships and potential grant writers and do potential work for us on various projects that we may need work done on. Talked with North State Grow Manufacturing Initiative and they are trying to bring manufacturing up to the North State. So that's another group that we may be able to work with in terms of possibly bringing manufacturers to Mount Shasta. I spoke with a couple of folks who where is their cards? Some folks who actually give counseling and advice to manufacturers, as small as maybe 15 employees, as large as 500 employees. I expressed the interest of Mount Shasta to have an industrial center as part of the landing, and they indicated that they were willing to talk to their companies, and hopefully we will build a dialogue with them and their clients about the possibility of getting some of those companies to either set up a second campus in Mount Shasta or perhaps to move to Mount Shasta. So that's the, I could go into more detail, but I felt like it was a well worthwhile trip. The cost to the city for my going down there was, I think, $100 motel room, which included the tax, which was like 10 or more %, and the cost of gas. So for less than 115 or 120 bucks, I think we got a lot out of it. Logan Smith was also there. We attended some of the same sessions, some different sessions.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, thank you all. I'd like to move now to the last item on the agenda, which is the future agenda topics. Suggestions for that? I believe we talked earlier about the report for solar opportunities after the evaluation that Climate Tech is doing. Did I misunderstand you?
At this point, we're not ready to bring it forward. It's preliminary, we're not ready to bring it to the council at this point.
Okay, not within the next 90 days. Not
No.
within the okay, all right.
Why don't we keep housing on? If we can put that on the February 12th agenda in terms of the...
Before we do that, may I make a recommendation? You have a busy agenda on that day already, and I think we need to schedule Crystal Geyser for the 12th also. That being controversial, you may want to move to the 26th on your housing.
We're moving which one to the 26th?
Well,
Which one did you want to move to the 26th?
Housing?
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine with me. 26 is fine. I thought we could include in there the county's question to the city on their vacation rental policy. I did not get the impression from Terry that that was a time-sensitive matter, so I think the 26th would be fine for that.
Okay. Would the council concur putting Crystal Geyser on for the
Yes.
12th,
Next agenda.
next meeting?
I assume the police department surplus is something that could probably go on consent agenda for the 12th, yeah?
Perhaps, yeah.
Yes, that could go consent.
And I thought we had the fire department on the last meeting, but Matt Mello was ill. What happened? Did that fall away?
It's listed for the 12th. We'll have to
the
evaluate.
12th.
I'd like to just give us a chance to evaluate priorities when we get to pre-agenda, rather than nail down exactly when we're going to do what. It's appropriate to talk now about urgent issues and then let us schedule them, given other things that have come up, when we get to pre-agenda. What about PD negotiations? Where are we at with that?
Which negotiations?
The police department.
Oh, we need to put that on, I would say for the 26th. That has to be formal action of the council
I don't think so.
to impose.
Is it,
That should be pretty short.
okay.
That could even be on a consent agenda, perhaps. Yeah. The AmeriCorps Special Projects Team, I'm not sure what that is. Can somebody tell me?
Yeah, that was just an opportunity to talk with them about perhaps getting a team up here next summer. And it was an idea. I had a contact. It hasn't gone very far, I don't think. It keeps falling down because of the other priorities.
Well, maybe we can put that on the 26th.
Okay, well, we'll see. I understand. Yeah, I'll talk to the city manager about it. I'm also concerned about the emergency evacuation plan. Just want to make sure it happens this spring, as there's all the fire activity. They're anticipating a worse fire year this year because of the drought. So let's just not forget it.
We're anticipating a deluge of new regulations coming out of this, because as you know, we're catastrophic situations. So we can pretty much be ensured they're under review right now. So we would like to wait for those so we can do all at once.
The other thing that we need to have on the agenda that we discussed earlier this evening is a draft ordinance for the proposed tax measure.
Yes.
And I think you indicated you want to move ahead with that with all due speed, so it could be reviewed.
I would think that would be the 26th also, if council confers.
All right.
And we will have,
And perhaps what could be done before the 26th is have BOE review that draft before it even comes to council.
Oh, absolutely. We'll be calling them tomorrow morning.
Okay.
is that it? Okay, thank you. We are adjourned.